In the heart of Wyoming's cattle country, a chance encounter between two proud souls would change everything. Barrett "Bear" McAllister had built an empire from nothing: 10,000 head of cattle, thousands of acres, and a fortune that made him one of the richest men in 3 counties. Yet his grand cedar lodge sat empty and cold, gathering dust while he worked from dawn to dusk. When he hired Evelyn Reyes to clean his cabin, he expected a simple business arrangement. What he discovered instead shook him to his core. This 52-year-old widow wasn't just struggling to make ends meet. She was living in a collapsing line shack with 5 grandchildren, facing eviction by the railroad company. Bear's wealth suddenly felt hollow against the warmth of her courage, but would Evelyn's fierce pride allow her to accept help from a man who had everything she'd lost? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The empty coffee cup sat on Barrett McAllister's kitchen table like an accusation. 5:30 in the morning, and the silence in his cedar lodge stretched so thick he could feel it pressing against his shoulders. He'd built this house for Sarah 23 years ago, every beam and board chosen with her gentle hands in mind. Now the polished pine floors echoed with nothing but his own footsteps, and the stone fireplace she'd insisted on remained cold except on the loneliest winter nights. Everyone had called him that since he'd wrestled a yearling to the ground at age 12, stood 6'4" in his stocking feet, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or balance a ledger with equal skill. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and crow's feet mapped the corners of his eyes from decades of squinting into Wyoming sun. At 58, he commanded respect from every rancher in 3 counties, owned more cattle than some small towns had people, and could buy anything his heart desired. Except he couldn't buy back the sound of Sarah's laughter echoing through these rooms. The lodge sprawled across 2 acres of prime land, overlooking Stillwater Creek. Sarah had designed the great room with its cathedral ceiling and wall of windows facing the Absaroka Mountains. She'd sketched the wraparound porch where they'd planned to watch grandchildren play in the yard. The master bedroom upstairs still held her hope chest, and the guest rooms remained furnished and waiting for visitors who never came. Bear filled his coffee cup and walked to the kitchen window. The sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, just the way Sarah used to describe them. His cattle dotted the valley floor like scattered playing pieces, 5,000 head of prime Angus and Hereford stock. The operation ran itself these days, with 3 full-time hands and seasonal help during carving and branding. Success had given him everything he'd dreamed of as a young man, everything except someone to share it with. The telephone rang, sharp and insistent in the morning quiet. Bear answered on the 3rd ring. McAllister. Bear, it's Tom Henley down at the general store. Got a woman here looking for cleaning work. Says she heard you might need someone to tidy up that big house of yours. Bear frowned. I never said I needed. Now don't go getting your back up. Mrs. Patterson mentioned you'd been eating nothing but canned beans and burnt coffee for months. This lady seems decent enough, has references from over in Casper. Name's Evelyn Reyes. Bear's jaw tightened. The whole town seemed determined to manage his life since Sarah passed. I can take care of my own house. Course you can. But when's the last time those windows got a proper washing, or that kitchen floor saw a good scrubbing? Bear looked around his kitchen. Dishes sat stacked in the sink, and dust motes danced in the morning light. Sarah would have been mortified. Tell her to come by this afternoon. We'll see. Already did. She'll be there around 2. After Tom hung up, Bear stood holding the phone, wondering what he'd just agreed to. He'd tried hiring help before Mrs. Kowalski lasted 3 days before declaring the house too sad for a living soul, and the girl from town quit after 1 afternoon, claiming the silence gave her the creeps. Bear spent the morning checking fence lines and pretending he wasn't nervous about meeting this Evelyn Reyes. He rode his favorite gelding, Buck, along the creek where cottonwoods provided shade from the climbing sun. The familiar routine of checking cattle, mending wire, and marking repairs usually settled his mind. Today it only reminded him how much land he owned and how little life filled it. At exactly 2 o'clock, an ancient pickup truck rattled up his gravel drive. Bear watched from the barn as a woman climbed out, moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to make every motion count. She wore a simple blue dress, clean and pressed despite obvious age, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Even from a distance, he could see the straight line of her shoulders, the way she surveyed his property without the wide-eyed awe most visitors showed. Evelyn Reyes looked to be somewhere in her early 50s, with skin weathered by sun and wind. Her hands, Bear noticed as she knocked on his front door, bore the calluses and scars of hard work. When she smiled, it reached her brown eyes but carried shadows behind it. "Mr. McAllister, I'm Evelyn Reyes. Tom Henley said you might need some help with your house." Her voice held a slight Spanish accent, musical but careful. Bear found himself stepping back to let her inside, then immediately regretting it as he saw her take in the dusty furniture and cold fireplace. "It's a beautiful home," she said without judgment. "How long since your wife passed?" The direct question caught him off guard. Most people danced around Sarah's death, treating it like something contagious. 3 years this October. Evelyn nodded, understanding in her dark eyes. The house misses her. Something in Bear's chest loosened at her simple acceptance. Yes, it does. They walked through the rooms together, Evelyn asking practical questions about cleaning schedules and supplies. She admired Sarah's choice in furnishings without the false enthusiasm others showed, running her fingers along dusty surfaces with the appreciation of someone who understood the work behind maintaining such a place. "I can come 3 days a week," she said as they returned to the kitchen. "Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. The house needs regular attention to keep it healthy." "What do you charge?" $15 a day, and I provide my own supplies." Bear nearly laughed. He spent more than that on coffee in a week. "That's not enough." Evelyn's spine straightened. "It's a fair wage for fair work." "For someone else, maybe. This house has 12 rooms and 4 bathrooms. Make it 25. 15, she repeated firmly. "If the work's too much, I'll tell you." Bear studied her face, recognizing the pride he'd worn himself through lean years. "All right. When can you start?" "Tomorrow, if that suits you." After she left, Bear found himself looking at his house with new eyes. Dust coated the mantelpiece where Sarah's picture sat, and cobwebs had gathered in the corners she'd always kept spotless. For the first time in months, he felt something like anticipation. The next morning, Bear made sure to be out checking the north pasture when Evelyn arrived. He didn't want to hover like some anxious widow, which he realized with a start was exactly what he'd become. When he returned at noon, the change nearly knocked him sideways. Every window gleamed. The hardwood floors glowed with fresh polish. The kitchen smelled of lemon oil and something indefinably warm that reminded him of Sarah's baking days. Evelyn had left a note on the counter. "Started with the main rooms. We'll tackle the upstairs Thursday. Coffee's fresh on the stove." Bear poured himself a cup and sat at his kitchen table, now cleared and scrubbed to its original honey pine finish. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home instead of a mausoleum. He was still sitting there when Evelyn returned the following Thursday. This time, he was waiting. "Mr. McAllister," she nodded politely, carrying a basket of cleaning supplies. "Bear," he corrected. "Nobody calls me Mr. McAllister except the bank president and tax assessor." Her smile warmed by degrees. "Bear, then. I hope the work was satisfactory." "More than. Coffee?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I should get started upstairs." Bear watched her climb the staircase. Sarah had polished every week for 17 years, then forced himself to head outside. But throughout the day, he found excuses to return to the house. The sound of movement overhead, of someone caring for his home, drew him like music he'd forgotten existed. By the 3rd week, Bear had learned Evelyn's routine. She arrived at 8, started coffee first thing, then worked methodically through the house. She brought her own lunch in a paper sack, and ate on the back porch, looking out over the valley with an expression he couldn't quite read. On the fourth Thursday, rain drummed against the windows, and Bear made his decision. When lunchtime came, he knocked on the kitchen door frame. "Storm's getting worse. Why don't you eat inside today?" Evelyn looked up from her sandwich, uncertain. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding. It's your workplace." She joined him at the kitchen table, and for the first time in years, Bear wasn't eating alone. They talked carefully at first about the weather, the condition of his fence lines, the way dust seemed to multiply when no one was looking. Gradually, Bear learned pieces of her story. She'd been widowed 4 years ago when her husband Miguel was killed in a construction accident. Her daughter Carmen had died 2 years later in a car crash, leaving 5 children with no one else to turn to. Evelyn had moved from Casper to Wyoming seeking cheaper land and better opportunities, but work was scarce and money scarcer. 5 grandchildren, Bear said, trying to imagine the chaos and wonder of it. "How old?" "Tommy's 15, thinks he's a man already. The twins, Maria and Rosa, are 12. Little Carlos is 8, and Ana's just turned 6. Her voice softened when she spoke their names. "They're good children, but they've lost so much." Bear nodded, understanding the weight of caring for others while carrying your own grief. After Evelyn left that day, he found himself wondering where 5 children and their grandmother lived in a county where decent housing cost more than most families could afford. The answer came 2 weeks later when he decided to pay Evelyn in person instead of leaving her wages on the counter. She'd mentioned living east of town, near the old railroad line. Bear drove out on Friday evening, following her directions through increasingly rough country until he reached what had once been a settlement. The line shack sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, its roof patched with tin and tar paper. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and Bear could see laundry hanging on a rope strung between the house and a leaning shed. As he climbed out of his truck, he heard children's voices and caught the scent of something cooking beans, maybe with a hint of chilies. The door opened before he could knock. Evelyn stood there with flour on her apron and surprise in her eyes. "Bear? Is something wrong?" "Brought your wages," he said, then stopped as 5 faces appeared behind her. The children ranged from a tall, serious boy to a little girl with pigtails, all watching him with the wary curiosity of young creatures unsure whether he meant help or harm. Bear's throat tightened as he took in the scene beyond Evelyn's shoulder. The single room held a wood stove, a rough table, and bedrolls arranged on the floor. Boxes and crates served as furniture. It was clean and organized, but the poverty was absolute. This was where the woman who'd been bringing life back to his 12-room house lived with 5 children. This was where she came after polishing his floors and washing his windows. Bear stood in the doorway, his comfortable world tilting on its axis, and finally understood what wealth really meant. Bear stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior of the line shack. The railroad eviction notice was tacked to the wall beside the door, its red lettering stark against the weathered wood. He'd seen enough of these documents over the years to recognize the finality in its language. 30 days to vacate the premises for railroad expansion. "You didn't need to come all this way," Evelyn said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind her. Her voice carried a careful control that didn't quite mask the embarrassment underneath. "I would have gotten my wages Tuesday." Bear held out the envelope, his usual words failing him. Beyond the thin walls, he could hear the children's voices, a boy asking about homework, one of the girls singing softly to herself. The normalcy of it made the poverty more stark, not less. "How long do you have?" he asked, nodding toward the notice. Evelyn's jaw tightened. 3 weeks now. The railroad's buying up all the old settlement land for a new freight line. Where will you go?" She looked out across the empty prairie, her hands smoothing her apron in a gesture Bear was beginning to recognize as her way of buying time to think. "We'll manage. We always do." The door creaked open, and the oldest boy stepped out. Tommy had his grandmother's dark eyes and the kind of serious expression that comes from shouldering too much responsibility too young. He was tall for 15, all elbows and knees, with work-roughened hands that reminded Bear of his own at that age. "Abuela, the twins are fighting about the math again," Tommy said, then noticed Bear and straightened his shoulders. "Sir." "Tommy, this is Mr. McAllister, Bear. He's my employer." The boy extended his hand with careful politeness. "Thank you for giving Abuela work, sir. She's the best cleaner in 3 counties. Bear shook the calloused hand, impressed by the firm grip. "I believe that's true." A crash from inside the shack was followed by raised voices. Evelyn sighed and moved toward the door. "Excuse me, Maria and Rosa can't seem to agree on anything these days." Bear watched through the open door as Evelyn mediated between 2 girls who looked exactly alike, except for the stubborn set of their jaws. 12 years old, he guessed, with their grandmother's dignity and their grandfather's temper. A younger boy, Carla, sat at the rough table with a schoolbook, trying to ignore the commotion. The youngest, Anna, clutched a worn doll and watched everything with wide, solemn eyes. The space was impossibly small for 6 people. Bear's walk-in closet was larger than this entire room. Yet somehow Evelyn had created order from chaos. Bedrolls were neatly arranged, schoolbooks stacked on orange crates, and the smell of beans and cornbread filled the air with warmth, despite the poverty surrounding it. "Girls, we have company," Evelyn said firmly, and the arguing stopped immediately. "Come say hello to Mr. Bear." Maria and Rosa approached with identical expressions of curiosity. "Are you the one with all the cows?" Maria asked. "Some of them," Bear said, fighting a smile. "Tommy says you have more cows than there are people in our whole school," Rosa added. "Rosa," Tommy warned. "It's all right," Bear said. "I do have quite a few cattle." Little Carlos looked up from his book, pencil poised over a math problem. "Are you really rich like the stories say?" "Carlos," Evelyn's voice carried sharp embarrassment. Bear knelt down to the boy's level. "What stories?" "People in town say you could buy the whole county if you wanted, and that your house is so big you could fit 10 families in it." The innocent words hit Bear like a physical blow. Here was a family of 6, crowded into a space smaller than his pantry, and he lived alone in a house built for entertaining dozens. The mathematics of it made him feel sick. "Well," he said carefully, "it is a pretty big house." Anna, the youngest, stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old. "Do you get lonely in your big house all by yourself?" The question, asked with such simple directness, nearly undid him. Bear looked up to find Evelyn watching him, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes," he admitted. "We could visit you," Anna offered. "We're very good at visiting. Abuela taught us how to be polite and not touch things." Bear's throat tightened. "I'm sure you are." Evelyn stepped forward, her hands busy with her apron again. "Children, Mr. Bear has to get home, and you all have chores to finish before supper." The dismissal was gentle but firm. As the children reluctantly returned to their tasks, Evelyn walked Bear back to his truck. The evening air carried the scent of approaching winter, and Bear noticed how she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They're good children," he said. "They are. They've had to grow up too fast, but they're good." Bear struggled with the words he wanted to say. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, this family would be homeless unless he did something. But he could already see the pride in Evelyn's straight shoulders, the careful distance she maintained, even as she walked beside him. "Evelyn," he began, then stopped. "How did you offer help to someone whose dignity mattered more than comfort?" She seemed to sense his struggle. "We'll be fine, Bear. We always find a way." "The house I'm living in," he said slowly, "it has 6 bedrooms, guest rooms that nobody's used in years." Evelyn stopped walking. "No. Just until you find somewhere else. Until you get back on your feet." "No." Her voice carried absolute finality. "I work for you, Bear. I clean your house for fair wages. That's the beginning and the end of our arrangement. But the children are my responsibility, not yours." Bear felt frustration building in his chest. "So what's the plan? Where exactly are you going to go with 5 children and no money?" Evelyn's eyes flashed. That's not your concern. Maybe it should be. They stared at each other in the growing dusk, two stubborn people who'd learned to rely on themselves, facing an impossible situation. Bear could see the fear underneath Evelyn's fierce independence, just as she could probably see the desperation underneath his gruff offer. "I won't accept charity," she said quietly. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering rooms in a house that's too big for one person, to a family that needs them." In exchange for what? Bear hadn't thought that far ahead. Nothing. Just. "No," Evelyn shook her head. "Everything has a price, Bear. Everything. I've learned that the hard way." She turned and walked back toward the shack, leaving Bear standing beside his truck with the weight of his own helplessness. Through the thin walls, he could hear the family settling into their evening routine, dishes being washed, children being helped with homework, the soft sound of Anna's voice as someone read her a bedtime story. In 3 weeks, those sounds would stop. In 3 weeks, this family would scatter to wherever desperate people went when they had nowhere left to turn. Bear drove home through the darkening landscape, his comfortable house waiting for him with all its empty rooms and perfect silence. For the first time in his adult life, his wealth felt like a burden instead of an achievement. What good was owning half the county if he couldn't help one family when they needed it most? The next Tuesday, Evelyn arrived for work exactly on time, her manner professional and distant. She said nothing about their conversation, and Bear didn't push. But he noticed she worked with even more intensity than usual, as if trying to prove something to both of them. When she finished for the day, Bear was waiting in the kitchen with an envelope. "Your wages," he said, "plus a bonus for the extra work you've been doing." Evelyn looked inside the envelope and immediately tried to hand it back. "This is too much." "No, it's not enough. Not nearly enough." "Bear, keep it, please. Let me do this one thing." She looked at the money, then at his face, reading something there he didn't try to hide. Finally, she nodded once and tucked the envelope into her purse. "Thank you," she said simply. After she left, Bear stood in his spotless kitchen and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. If Evelyn wouldn't accept help directly, he'd have to find another way. Because watching that family face homelessness while he rattled around in his empty house wasn't something he could live with. The railroad eviction notice gave them 3 weeks. Bear gave himself the same deadline to figure out how to save them, whether Evelyn's pride liked it or not. Bear found Sarah's recipe box on Thursday morning, tucked behind flower canisters in the pantry. The wooden box, painted with small wildflowers by Sarah's own hand, had been gathering dust for 3 years. As he lifted the lid, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifted up, ghost fragrances of the woman who'd filled this kitchen with warmth and purpose. Inside, hundreds of handwritten cards detailed everything from Sunday pot roast to Christmas cookies. Sarah's careful script covered each recipe, often with notes about family preferences, extra pepper for Bear or double batch for church social. Some bore stains from years of use, evidence of meals shared and memories made. Bear held a card for apple pie, remembering how Sarah would roll out dough on the marble pastry board she'd insisted they install. The board sat unused now, another surface Evelyn polished to gleaming perfection without knowing its history. Everything in this house carried Sarah's fingerprints, yet somehow Evelyn's presence was breathing life back into spaces that had become shrines. When Evelyn arrived that morning, she found Bear sitting at the kitchen table with the recipe box open beside him. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't mean to disturb anything private." "You didn't disturb it. I found it." Bear closed the box gently. "My wife's recipes. Haven't looked at them since. Evelyn set down her cleaning supplies and approached carefully, the way she might approach a wounded animal. "She cooked a lot?" "Every day. This kitchen was her domain." Bear ran his hand along the smooth surface of the table. "She said a house wasn't a home unless it smelled like something good was always cooking." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Bear looked up at Evelyn, taking in her careful expression. "Would you, that is, I was wondering if you might consider doing some cooking along with the cleaning. I'd pay extra, of course. Evelyn's eyebrows rose. You want me to cook for you? The children mentioned you make good cornbread, and I haven't had a decent meal in months. The half-truth came easily. What Bear really wanted was to fill his kitchen with the sounds and smells of life again. Evelyn's careful presence had already begun the process, but adding cooking would complete the transformation he'd begun to crave. I don't know your tastes, Evelyn said slowly, and I'm used to cooking simple food for children. Simple's fine. Better than fine. Bear gestured toward the recipe box. Maybe you could try some of Sarah's recipes. They're all family favorites. Evelyn considered this, and Bear held his breath. He sensed they were negotiating something larger than mealsome, unspoken agreement about the boundaries of their relationship. I could make lunch when I'm here, she said finally. Nothing fancy. That would be perfect. The next Tuesday, Bear came in from the morning chores to find his kitchen transformed. The scent of onions and peppers filled the air, and something bubbled quietly on the stove. Evelyn stood at the counter, chopping vegetables with the efficient movements of someone who'd fed a family for decades. Smells incredible, Bear said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. Beef stew. I found the recipe in your wife's box. Evelyn glanced at him uncertainly. I hope that's all right. More than all right. Bear watched her work, noting the confidence in her hands as she seasoned and stirred. This was different from her cleaningless, careful, more instinctive. She moved around his kitchen as if she belonged there, unconsciously claiming the space Sarah had once ruled. When lunch was ready, Evelyn served 2 bowls and joined him at the table. The stew was rich and hearty, with perfectly tender vegetables and meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. But more than the food itself, Bear savored the companionship. Having someone across from him, sharing a meal he hadn't prepared himself, felt like stepping back into the world of the living. This is Sarah's recipe exactly, he said. How did you know about the bay leaves? The card mentioned them, but it also had a note that said Bear's favorite. I figured they must be important. Bear paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. Sarah had always added extra bay leaves because she knew he loved the subtle flavor they brought to beef dishes. Somehow, Evelyn had understood that the notes were as important as the ingredients. Thank you, he said quietly. Over the following weeks, Bear's kitchen came alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Evelyn arrived early on cooking days, often bringing vegetables from the small garden she maintained behind the line shack. She experimented with Sarah's recipes, adapting them to available ingredients and making each dish her own while honoring the original intent. Bear found himself timing his work to be in the house when she cooked. He'd sit at the kitchen table with paperwork, ostensibly managing ranch business, while actually watching Evelyn move through the familiar routines of meal preparation. She had a different style than Sarah, more improvisational, more willing to trust her instincts, but the same underlying care that turned simple ingredients into comfort. You're hovering, Evelyn said one Thursday, not looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. I'm working. You're watching me like you expect me to burn down your kitchen. Bear set down his pen and laughed. You caught me. I haven't seen anyone cook in this kitchen for 3 years. It's, he searched for the right word, mesmerizing. Evelyn's hands stilled on the dough. I could teach you basic things. Man needs to know how to feed himself. I can manage canned beans and coffee. That's not feeding yourself. That's surviving. Evelyn shaped the dough into a loaf and placed it in the pan. Cooking is about more than just food. It's about caring for yourself, respecting the day, making a home instead of just occupying a house. The wisdom in her words struck Bear silent. For 3 years, he'd been occupying his house like a ghost haunting familiar rooms. Evelyn's presence was teaching him the difference between existing and living. As November progressed and the eviction deadline drew closer, Bear noticed changes in Evelyn's demeanor. She worked with increased intensity, as if trying to pack extra value into each day. Her smiles came less easily, and he caught her staring out windows with an expression of barely contained worry. The children, when Bear encountered them during his weekly visits to pay Evelyn, showed similar signs of stress. Tommy had grown quieter, more protective of his younger siblings. The twins argued more frequently, their usual cheerfulness strained. Carlos threw himself into his schoolwork with desperate focus, while little Anna clung to her grandmother with increasing frequency. Bear's frustration mounted daily. He owned thousands of acres of land, had money enough to solve their problems 10 times over, yet Evelyn's pride kept him at arm's length while her family faced disaster. Every day he watched her transform his house into a home while knowing she might soon have no home of her own. On a particularly cold Thursday in late November, Bear came in from feeding cattle to find Evelyn sitting at his kitchen table with her head in her hands. The unprecedented sight of her vulnerability stopped him in the doorway. "Evelyn, what's wrong?" She looked up, and Bear saw tears she'd been too proud to let fall. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't. This isn't professional." "Forget professional. What happened?" "The twins were sent home from school today. They don't have proper winter coats, and the temperature dropped below what the school considers safe." Evelyn's voice carried a shame that cut through Bear like a blade. "I've been saving every penny for the move, but I can't buy coats and find us a place to live too." Bear felt something crack open in his chest. These children were going cold while he had closets full of barely worn clothes. This proud, capable woman was rationing between her grandchildren's warmth and their shelter. "I have an idea," he said carefully. "Sarah left behind some things. Winter coats, sweaters, they've been sitting in storage for 3 years. Maybe—" "No." Evelyn stood abruptly. "I can't take your wife's things. She would have wanted children to use them. Sarah always said clothes were meant to keep people warm, not collect dust in closets." Evelyn wavered, maternal instinct warring with pride. Bear pressed his advantage gently. "Just look at them. If they don't fit, or the children don't like them, no harm done." That afternoon, Bear led Evelyn to the upstairs storage room, where Sarah's belongings waited in careful preservation. Cedar chests and garment bags held the artifacts of a life-cut short formal dresses Sarah had worn, to Cattlemen's Association dinners, everyday clothes, soft with wear and washing, and yes, several warm winter coats in various sizes. Evelyn touched the fabrics with reverent fingers, understanding that she was being trusted with precious memories. "These are beautiful things, too fine for everyday wear." Sarah would disagree. She believed beautiful things should be used, not admired from a distance. They selected 2 coats that would fit the twins, along with sweaters for the boys and a small jacket perfect for Anna. As Evelyn folded each item carefully, Bear watched her face soften with gratitude and something that might have been hope. "I'll pay you back," she said. "When we're settled somewhere, I'll find a way to repay you for this kindness." "Consider it an advance on wages," Bear said. "You've been worth far more than I've been paying you." As they packed the clothes into bags, Bear felt Sarah's presence in the room, not the sad ghost that had haunted him for 3 years, but the warm spirit who'd always wanted to mother every stray that crossed their path. For the first time since her death, his memories of Sarah brought comfort instead of pain. Evelyn left that day with more than clothes. She carried with her a piece of Bear's trust and the beginning of an understanding that some gifts were too important for pride to refuse. Bear spread the hand-drawn blueprints across his kitchen table, the pencil lines marking measurements and angles for rebuilding the line shack. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights sketching and calculating, figuring how to transform the crumbling structure into something worthy of Evelyn and her grandchildren. The plans showed a modest but solid home, 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a stone foundation that would last generations. But plans were just paper dreams if he couldn't buy the land first. The morning sun streamed through windows that sparkled, thanks to Evelyn's care, illuminating the careful drawings. Bear had built most of the structures on his ranch himself, working alongside his father and later with hired crews. His hands knew the language of lumber and nails, could read the stress points in a foundation and the wisdom of proper drainage. This project would be different, though. This would be building hope. Those looked like serious plans. Bear looked up to find Evelyn standing in the kitchen doorway, her cleaning supplies forgotten. She approached the table with the careful curiosity of someone who'd learned to be wary of other people's schemes. "Just some ideas I've been working on," Bear said, starting to roll up the papers. "Wait." Evelyn's hand touched his wrist, stopping him. "May I see?" Bear hesitated, then smoothed the blueprints flat again. Evelyn studied them with the eye of someone who understood both construction and necessity. Her finger traced the outline of the kitchen, lingered over the notation for built-in storage. "This is the line shack," she said quietly. "Isn't it?" "It could be, with some work." Evelyn's expression grew guarded. "Bear, just look at the plans. Nothing more than that." She bent over the drawings, and Bear watched understanding dawn in her face. He'd designed the house around her family's needs, a small room perfect for Anna, space for the twins to have their own area, a kitchen large enough for proper cooking, but cozy enough for homework at the table. "The foundation's the key," Bear explained, unable to help himself. "Current structure sits on fieldstones and hope. These plans call for poured concrete with proper drainage. House would last 100 years. Bear." Evelyn's voice carried a warning. "I'm not suggesting anything, just showing you what's possible." But they both knew he was suggesting everything. The plans represented more than construction. They offered permanence, security, the radical idea that Evelyn's family deserved a home instead of constant uncertainty. "The railroad owns the land," Evelyn said finally. "For now." She looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" Bear had already made inquiries, quietly and through intermediaries. The railroad was selling the settlement land in parcels, more interested in clearing their books than maximizing profit. The line shack sat on 2 acres that could be purchased for less than Bear spent on feed in a good month. "It means nothing's impossible if you want it badly enough." Evelyn rolled up the plans with careful precision, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I can't let you do this." "You're not letting me do anything. I'm thinking about doing it myself." "For what purpose?" "You have no need for another house." Bear struggled with honesty, with the words that would explain his motivation without sounding like pity or charity. "Maybe I need to build something instead of just maintaining what I have. Maybe I need to create instead of just remember." The partial truth satisfied neither of them, but it was all Bear could offer without revealing the depth of his feelings for Evelyn, for her family, for the possibility of purpose beyond his own comfort. That afternoon, while Evelyn worked upstairs, Bear called his lawyer in Cheyenne. James Morrison had handled Bear's business for 15 years, had helped him acquire most of his land holdings through careful negotiation and impeccable timing. "Barrett, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" "I need to buy some land from the railroad, settlement property east of town." "How much are we talking about?" 2 acres. There's a line shack on it, family living there, who's about to be evicted." James's pause spoke volumes. "This is about the woman who works for you. This is about a business opportunity." "Barrett, can you handle the purchase or not?" "Of course I can. But are you sure about this? Mixing business with personal feelings rarely ends well." Bear looked up the staircase, where he could hear Evelyn moving furniture to clean properly underneath. "Set up the purchase, quietly. I don't want the current occupants to know until it's done." After hanging up, Bear sat in his kitchen and tried to imagine Christmas in a house filled with children's voices. The thought both terrified and thrilled him. For 3 years, holidays had been endurance tests he survived by working longer hours and drinking too much coffee. This year could be different if Evelyn would let it. The next week brought the first real snow of the season. Bear woke to a world transformed, white drifts covering the familiar landscape in pristine silence. By the time Evelyn arrived, the temperature had dropped enough to make even heated trucks uncomfortable. "Roads are getting bad," Bear said as she stomped snow off her boots. "Maybe you should head home early today. I can manage a little snow." But Bear noticed how she rubbed her hands together, how she kept her coat on longer than usual. The line shack had minimal insulation and heating that depended on a wood stove she couldn't always afford to feed properly. "At least let me drive you home." My truck handles better in this weather. Evelyn's independent streak warred with practical necessity, pride lost to maternal responsibility. If you're sure it's no trouble. No trouble at all. That evening, Bear followed Evelyn's truck through the snow-covered landscape, emergency flashes blinking like amber beacons in the growing dusk. When they reached the line shack, he insisted on checking their wood supply and ended up splitting 2 hours' worth of logs while Evelyn prepared dinner. Inside the cramped space, the children welcomed him with the easy acceptance of youth. Ana showed him her drawing of snow angels, while Carlos demonstrated his improving reading skills. The twins argued good-naturedly about whose turn it was to help with dishes, and Tommy discussed his plans for finishing school and finding work to help support the family. Bear found himself drawn into their evening routine, helping with homework, listening to stories, watching Evelyn orchestrate the complex dance of bedtime preparations for 5 children in a space barely large enough for 2 adults. The poverty remained stark, but the love was overwhelming. "You don't have to stay," Evelyn said as she tucked Anna into her bedroll. "I don't mind. It's nice having company." The simple admission surprised them both. Bear had grown so accustomed to solitude that he'd forgotten the pleasure of being part of a family's daily rhythm. Here, surrounded by children's chatter and domestic warmth, his loneliness seemed like a choice he'd made rather than a fate he'd been handed. After the children were settled, Bear and Evelyn sat by the wood stove, drinking coffee and listening to the wind outside. The intimacy of the moment, 2 adults stealing quiet time while children slept nearby, felt both natural and precious. "Tell me about your husband," Bear said softly. Evelyn's hands wrapped around her coffee mug, seeking warmth or comfort. "Miguel was a good man, worked construction, sent money home to his family in Mexico, never missed church on Sunday. He wanted to buy land someday, have a place where we could grow old together." "What happened?" "Bridge project outside Casper. Something went wrong with the scaffolding." Evelyn's voice stayed steady, but Bear saw the old pain in her eyes. "He died trying to help his crew get to safety." Bear nodded, understanding the weight of losing someone whose dreams had been tied to your own. "Sarah wanted children. We tried for years, but it never happened. She said this house was too big for just 2 people, that we should fill it with foster children or relatives who needed a home." "Why didn't you?" "I thought we had time, thought there would be years to make those kinds of decisions." Bear stared into the fire. "Now I rattle around in all that space like a marble in a coffee can." Evelyn looked at him with new understanding. "Is that why you want to help us? To fill the empty spaces?" The question cut closer to truth than Bear was ready to admit. "Maybe. Or maybe I just can't stand seeing good people struggle when I have more than I need." "Pity, then." "Respect," Bear corrected firmly. "What you've done, raising 5 children while carrying your own grief that takes more strength than I've ever needed. It's not pity I feel. It's admiration." Evelyn studied his face in the firelight, searching for deception or patronizing kindness. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "The children ask about you sometimes," she said. "Tommy wants to know if you ever get tired of being rich. Carlos thinks you must be lonely in such a big house. Anna wants to know if you like cookies because she could make some for you." Bear laughed despite the tightness in his throat. "Tell Anna I love cookies. Tell Tommy that money doesn't cure loneliness. And tell Carlos he's right. I do get lonely sometimes." "And what should I tell myself?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Bear looked at this woman who'd brought his house back to life, who'd shown him the difference between existing and living, who faced each day with a courage that humbled him. Tell yourself that some gifts aren't charity. Some gifts are just one person recognizing what another person needs and trying to help. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the line shack, 2 people who'd known loss were learning to hope again. The family photograph lay in 3 pieces on Evelyn's makeshift dresser, torn down the middle where the paper had finally given way to years of careful handling. Bear discovered it during one of his evening visits when Anna had proudly shown him her treasure box, a small wooden crate that held her most precious possessions. "That's Mama and Papa," Anna said, pointing to the separated pieces. "And that's all of us before Carlos got so tall. Abuela keeps it by her bed so she can say good morning to them." Bear studied the fragments, seeing a younger Evelyn standing beside a man with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. 5 children clustered around them, including a woman who must have been Carmen Evelyn's daughter and the children's mother. The happiness in their faces made the torn photograph even more heartbreaking. "Would you like me to fix this?" Bear asked gently. Anna's eyes lit up. "You can do that?" "I think so. I'll need to take it with me, but I'll bring it back good as new." That evening, Bear sat at his kitchen table with photo repair tape and infinite patience, slowly reconstructing the image that meant everything to a little girl and her grandmother. As he worked, he found himself studying the faces, learning the history of this family through their expressions and body language. Miguel Reyes had been a compact man with strong shoulders and an easy smile. He stood with one hand on his wife's waist and the other on Tommy's shoulder, clearly comfortable in his role as family protector. Carmen resembled her mother, but with Miguel's more open expression, her arm around the twins while baby Anna sat on her lap. This had been a complete family, once parents and children and grandparents, all connected by bonds of love and shared dreams. Now only Evelyn remained to hold the pieces together, carrying the weight of all those lost connections while trying to forge new ones with her grandchildren. When Bear finished the repair, the photograph looked almost perfect. The tear lines remained visible if you knew where to look, but the image was whole again. He planned to give it back the next morning, but a December blizzard changed everything. The storm hit without warning, transforming the Wyoming landscape into a white wilderness where roads disappeared and temperatures plummeted to life-threatening lows. Bear spent the morning checking on his cattle, making sure they had access to windbreaks and feed. By noon, the wind was howling at 60 miles per hour, and the snow was falling so thick he could barely see his own barn. His first thought was of Evelyn and the children in their poorly insulated line shack. The wood stove that barely heated the single room wouldn't be enough in weather this severe. If the power lines went down, and they probably would, the family would be in real danger. Bear fought his way through the storm to his truck, the repaired photograph tucked safely in his coat pocket. The drive to the line shack took 3 times longer than usual, his heavy pickup sliding on the snow-packed roads despite 4-wheel drive. Several times he wondered if he should turn back, but the image of Anna's small face kept him moving forward. When he finally reached the settlement, he found the line shack nearly buried in snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, but the building looked fragile against the storm's fury. Bear battled through the drifts to reach the door, arriving half-frozen and completely covered in snow. "Bear!" Evelyn opened the door before he could knock, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "What are you doing out in this weather?" "Checking on you." He stomped inside, shaking snow from his coat. "This storm's going to get worse before it gets better." The children clustered around him, excited by his dramatic arrival. Even in the dim light of kerosene lamps, Bear could see his breath in the cold air. The wood stove glowed cherry red, but it was fighting a losing battle against the bitter wind that found every crack in the old walls. "Power's been out since this morning," Evelyn said, wrapping a blanket around Anna, who was shivering despite being dressed in layers. "We're managing fine, but it is getting cold." Bear looked around the cramped space, taking in the reality of their situation. 6 people huddled in a room barely larger than his pantry, with inadequate heating and no backup power. The twins sat close together on their bedroll, sharing warmth under a quilt. Carlos had wrapped himself in a coat while trying to do homework by lamplight. Tommy was splitting their dwindling supply of firewood into smaller pieces to make it last longer. "Pack some things," Bear said quietly to Evelyn. "You're all coming home with me." "No." Her response was automatic, ingrained by months of protecting her independence. "We'll be fine here." "Evelyn, look around. Really look." Bear kept his voice low so the children wouldn't hear the urgency. "This storm could last days. You don't have enough wood, and the temperature's still dropping." What happens if one of the children gets sick? As if summoned by his words, Anna began coughing, a harsh sound that cut through the room's tension. Evelyn was at her side immediately, feeling the little girl's forehead with worry etched across her features. "She's been fighting a cold all week," Evelyn murmured. "The dampness in here doesn't help. My house has a furnace that works, plenty of food, and rooms where everyone can be warm and comfortable." Bear pulled the repaired photograph from his pocket. "Anna asked me to fix this." "I did, but I think she needs to be somewhere safe to enjoy it." Anna's eyes widened as she saw the restored family picture. "You fixed Mama and Papa." "I did, and now I'd like all of you to come stay where it's warm so Anna can get over her cough." The children looked between the adults, sensing the weight of the decision being made. Bear could see Evelyn's internal struggle, her pride warring with her love for her grandchildren. Outside, the wind howled louder, and more cold air leaked through the old walls. "Just until the storm passes," Bear added. "A few days at most." Tommy spoke up from where he sat with the firewood. "Abuela, Anna's been coughing all night, and Maria's hands are so cold she can't hold her pencil." It was the practical concern in the 15-year-old's voice that finally broke through Evelyn's resistance. She looked at her grandchildren, really looked at them, and saw what Bear saw. Children trying to be brave while slowly losing the battle against cold and discomfort. "Just until the storm passes," she said finally. The next hour was controlled chaos as they gathered essential belongings and loaded them into Bear's truck. The children were excited despite the circumstances, chattering about finally seeing the inside of the famous McAllister house. Bear made 2 trips through the deepening snow, carrying suitcases and the precious few possessions that made a house feel like home. The drive back to the lodge was treacherous but triumphant. Bear's truck cut through the snow like a ship through rough seas, its headlights illuminating a world transformed into white wilderness. In the passenger seat, Evelyn held Anna close, whispering reassurances, while the little girl clutched her restored family photograph. When they finally reached Bear's house, warm light spilled from every window like a beacon in the storm. The children tumbled out of the truck with wonder, staring up at the lodge that had featured in so many local stories. To them, it must have seemed like a castle, vast, warm, and impossibly luxurious. Inside, Bear watched his house come alive in ways he'd never imagined. The twins raced through the great room, marveling at the cathedral ceiling and stone fireplace. Carlos stood transfixed by the wall of windows facing the mountains, even though the storm obscured the view. Tommy examined the sturdy construction with the eye of someone who understood the difference between adequate shelter and true craftsmanship. "Oh my," Evelyn whispered, taking in the polished floors and comfortable furniture, the sense of permanence and prosperity that emanated from every surface. "Anna, would you like to see your room?" Bear asked the youngest, who was still staring around in amazement. "My room?" Bear led them upstairs, where 6 guest bedrooms waited in perfect readiness. He'd prepared for this moment without fully admitting it to himself, ensuring each room had fresh linens and adequate heating. Anna chose the smallest bedroom, which faced east toward the mountains and had a window seat perfect for reading. "The twins can share the blue room," Bear suggested. "And Carlos, there's a room with its own desk for your schoolwork. Tommy, the corner room has the best view of the cattle pastures." "Where will I sleep?" Evelyn asked, her voice careful. "Master guest suite at the end of the hall. It has its own bathroom and sitting area." As the family settled into their temporary rooms, Bear felt his house transform around their presence. Voices echoed through hallways that had known only silence. Footsteps crossed floors that had been walked only by ghosts and memories. The central heating system, rarely taxed by one lonely man, hummed with purpose as it warmed spaces meant for living. That evening, they gathered in the kitchen for dinner, the first meal Bear had shared with a full table since Sarah's death. Evelyn had insisted on cooking, despite Bear's protests that she was a guest. She moved through his kitchen with increasing confidence, opening cabinets to find serving dishes, adjusting the stove temperature with practiced ease. "This is like Thanksgiving," Anna declared, surveying the table laden with pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans and fresh bread. "Better than Thanksgiving," Carlos added. "Thanksgiving never had a fireplace this big." Bear looked around the table at 5 children who were warm and fed and safe, at the woman who had brought life back to his empty house, and felt something shift in his chest. For 3 years, he'd been a man haunted by loss. Tonight, he was a man surrounded by possibility. "Tomorrow, we'll assess the storm damage," he said. "See how long before it's safe for you to go home." But even as he spoke the words, Bear found himself hoping the storm would last longer than necessary. Not because he wanted the family to remain displaced, but because he couldn't imagine going back to silence after experiencing the joy of a house filled with laughter. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Bear and Evelyn sat in his living room, watching snow swirl past the windows. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the house settled around them with the contented sounds of a home well used. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. "I know this isn't what you planned when you offered me cleaning work." "No," Bear agreed. "It's better than what I planned." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had learned to find peace in each other's company. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a new kind of family was learning to trust in the possibility of second chances. Bear's father's pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm, the gold case worn smooth by 3 generations of McAllister hands. He'd inherited it along with the land, the cattle, and the weight of family expectations. Now, sitting in his study while the storm continued its assault outside, he wondered what his father would think of the changes taking place in this house. The watch had belonged to his grandfather first, a homesteader who'd carved a life from raw Wyoming territory with nothing but determination and faith. His father had carried it through drought years and cattle market crashes, through the lean times when the ranch barely survived and the prosperous years when it thrived. Now it was Bear's turn to carry the family legacy, but the path forward had become something his ancestors never could have imagined. Through the study walls, he could hear the children settling into their new temporary home. Anna's cough had already improved in the warm, dry air. The twins were giggling about something in their shared room. Carlos was reading aloud to himself, practicing for a school presentation he might miss if the storm continued. Tommy was helping Evelyn organize their belongings in the master guest suite. These sounds, the sounds of family life, were exactly what his father had dreamed of when he'd expanded the original homestead into this grand lodge. Samuel McAllister had built this house with the expectation that it would shelter generations of McAllisters, that the rooms would ring with children's voices, and the kitchen would be the heart of a thriving family operation. Instead, the house had remained childless during Bear's marriage, and after Sarah's death, it had become a monument to unfulfilled dreams, until now. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Bear?" Evelyn's voice carried through the door. "I wanted to thank you again, and to ask about breakfast. The children are early risers." "Come in." Bear tucked the watch back into his vest pocket. "And you don't need to cook. We can manage with cereal and coffee." Evelyn entered the study, looking around at the leather-bound books and mounted photographs of prize bulls. "This room suits you. It feels like the center of your operation." "My father's operation, really. I've just been maintaining what he built." "From what I've seen, you've done much more than maintain." Evelyn approached the desk where Bear kept his ranch records, her eyes taking in the careful ledgers and detailed breeding charts. "This is the work of someone who cares deeply about continuing something important." Bear joined her at the desk, pulling out maps that showed the ranch's boundaries and growth over the decades. "We started with 160 acres. My grandfather's homestead claim. My father expanded it to 2,000 acres. I've added another 3,000 over the years. That's a substantial legacy. It's also a substantial responsibility." Bear traced the property lines with his finger. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been so focused on preserving what came before that I've forgotten to build something new." Evelyn studied his profile, reading the uncertainty he rarely let others see. What would building something new look like? Before Bear could answer, Anna appeared in the doorway, her hair mussed from sleep and her arms wrapped around the repaired family photograph. "Bear, I can't sleep. The house makes different sounds than our house." Bear knelt to her level. "What kind of sounds?" "Happy sounds, like it's glad we're here." Anna looked up at him with the serious expression children wore when sharing important observations. "Do you think houses get lonely too?" The question hit Bear with unexpected force. "I think they might, sweetheart. What do you think we should do about that?" "We should keep it company, at least until the storm stops." After Evelyn tucked Anna back into bed, she returned to find Bear still standing in the study doorway, staring down the hallway where warm light spilled from occupied bedrooms. "She's right, you know," Evelyn said quietly. "The house does seem different with people in it, more alive." "I've been thinking the same thing." Bear closed the study door and led Evelyn to the kitchen, where he put on a pot of coffee. "I've also been thinking about your situation. The railroad deadline is next week." Evelyn's shoulders tensed. "I know. I've been trying not to think about it while we're here, but I know." "I've made some inquiries." Bear poured 2 cups of coffee, buying time to find the right words. "The railroad is selling the settlement land in parcels, individual sales to clear their books quickly. I can't afford to buy land, Bear. I can barely afford to rent it. What if someone else bought it? Someone who could ensure you and the children had security?" Evelyn set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been looking into purchasing your parcel. 2 acres, including the line shack." "No." The word came out sharp and final. "Absolutely not. Hear me out. No, Bear. I won't be your charity case. I won't be the poor family you rescue out of guilt or loneliness or whatever this is." Bear felt his own temper rise. "This isn't about charity. This is about doing what makes sense." "For who? For you, who wants to feel better about having more than you need? Or for me, who would spend the rest of my life feeling like a kept woman? For the children, who deserve better than uncertainty and fear." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock and the storm's continued howling outside. Evelyn stared at Bear with a mixture of anger and hurt, while he struggled to explain motivations that even he didn't fully understand. "You think I don't want security for my grandchildren?" Evelyn's voice was deadly quiet. "You think I haven't lost sleep every night for months, wondering where we'll go and how we'll manage? Then let me help. At what cost? My dignity, my independence, the knowledge that everything my family has comes from your generosity." Bear ran his hands through his hair, frustrated by the circular nature of their argument. "What's the alternative, Evelyn? What's your plan when the railroad takes the land next week?" "I don't know." The admission came out broken, all her fierce pride cracking under the weight of honesty. "I don't know, and that terrifies me every single day." They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, separated by more than physical space. 2 people who cared about each other, who wanted the same outcome, but who couldn't bridge the gap between his need to provide and her need to maintain her self-respect. "There has to be a middle ground," Bear said finally. "Some way to do this that preserves your dignity and keeps the children safe." "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not giving up on finding one." The next morning brought clearing skies and the monumental task of digging out from 2 feet of snow. Bear worked alongside Tommy to clear the driveway, while the younger children built snow forts and engaged in epic snowball battles. Evelyn spent the day cooking and cleaning with obvious joy, her movements through the house confident and purposeful. Watching her work, Bear realized that Evelyn had transformed his house not through any grand gestures, but through 1,000 small acts of care. She'd rearranged furniture to encourage conversation, placed books and magazines where people might actually read them, opened curtains to let in maximum light. Under her influence, his showcase house was becoming a home. That evening, the county snowplow finally cleared the main roads, making it possible for the family to return to the line shack. The children received this news with notably less enthusiasm than Bear had expected. "Do we have to go back tonight?" Maria asked. "Can't we stay one more day?" Rosa added. "I like my room here," Carlos said wistfully. It has a real desk. Bear felt his heart constrict. He'd grown accustomed to their presence more quickly than seemed possible. The thought of returning to silence after 3 days of laughter and conversation felt like stepping backward into a life he no longer wanted. "We should go," Evelyn said firmly, though Bear caught the reluctance in her voice. "We've imposed on Bear's hospitality long enough." "It's not an imposition," Bear said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like." Tommy, showing wisdom beyond his 15 years, spoke up. "We appreciate everything you've done for us, Mr. Bear, but Abuela's right. We need to go home." Except the line shack wasn't home, Bear thought. It was temporary shelter, growing more temporary by the day. Home was where people belonged, where they felt safe and valued and free to build a future. Home was what this house had become over the past 3 days. As the family packed their belongings, Bear made a decision that would change everything. He pulled Evelyn aside while the children were gathering their clothes. "I'm going to buy the land," he said quietly, "whether you approve or not. But I'm not going to put it in your name or hold it over you in any way. I'm going to buy it and hold it in trust for the children's future." Evelyn started to protest, but Bear held up his hand. "Let me finish. The land will belong to Tommy, Maria, Rosa, Carlos, and Aina when they come of age. Equal shares. In the meantime, you'll have security and the right to live there as long as you choose. No rent, no obligations, except to let me help rebuild the house into something worthy of your family." Bear. "It's not charity, Evelyn. It's investment. In their future, in the community, in the idea that good people deserve good things." Bear pulled out the pocket watch, its weight familiar in his palm. "My grandfather homesteaded his land. My father expanded it. Maybe my contribution is making sure the next generation has the same opportunity." Evelyn looked at the watch, understanding its significance. "You don't owe us anything." "No," Bear agreed, "but maybe that's exactly why I want to do this. Because it's not about obligation or debt, it's about choice. And I choose to believe that some gifts don't come with strings attached." As the family prepared to leave, Anna approached Bear with the restored photograph clutched in her small hands. "Thank you for fixing our family picture," she said solemnly, "and thank you for letting us stay in your happy house." Bear knelt down to her level, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for making it happy, sweetheart." After they left, Bear stood in his empty kitchen and listened to the silence that had been his constant companion for 3 years. But now the silence felt different, not like an ending, but like a pause between movements in a larger symphony. Tomorrow he would call his lawyer and begin the process of purchasing the settlement land. Tomorrow he would start building something new instead of just maintaining what came before. Tonight he would plan for a future that included the sound of children's laughter and the warmth of a woman who had taught him the difference between existing and living. Bear found Sarah's hidden letters on a grey January morning while searching for the deed to the north pasture. The manila envelope was tucked behind other documents in the safe, labelled in Sarah's careful handwriting, "For Bear when you're ready to understand." His hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside were 17 letters, all addressed to him but never sent, spanning the years from their wedding to her death. The dates told a story he'd never known, hopes and fears his wife had carried alone, dreams she'd never shared, pain she'd hidden behind her gentle smile. The first letter, dated just 6 months after their wedding, began with words that stopped his heart. "My dearest Bear, I went to Dr. Harrison today and learned what I'd suspected for weeks. We lost our first baby before I even knew to tell you about him. The doctor says these things happen, that we're young and healthy, and there will be other chances. But I find myself mourning a child you never knew existed, grieving for a future that feels suddenly fragile." Bear sank into his desk chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Sarah had been pregnant, she'd lost a baby and never told him. The revelation rewrote everything he thought he'd known about their early marriage, about the careful distance she'd maintained during certain conversations about children. The letters continued chronologically, each one revealing another layer of pain and hope. Sarah had miscarried 4 times over the years, each loss carefully hidden from him to protect what she perceived as his contentment with their childless life. She'd consulted specialists in Denver and Cheyenne, underwent treatments she'd disguised as visits to her sister, carried the weight of their childlessness as if it were her personal failure. "I see how you watch other families," she'd written in year 5 of their marriage. "How your eyes follow children in the store or at church functions. I know you want to be a father, but you're too kind to put that burden on me when my body keeps failing us. So I carry this secret like a stone in my chest, hoping that someday I'll find the courage to tell you why I spend so many evenings staring out the window at the empty pastures where our children should be playing." Bear had to stop reading. He walked to the window that Sarah had mentioned, the one facing the back pasture where she'd imagined children running and laughing. All those evenings when he'd found her there, quiet and contemplative, he'd assumed she was simply enjoying the view. Instead, she'd been mourning the family they'd never had. The middle letters chronicled Sarah's attempts to convince him to adopt or foster children. She'd researched agencies, visited orphanages, made subtle suggestions that Bear had dismissed as passing fancies. His resistance, born from his own fears of inadequacy as a father figure, had been interpreted by Sarah as satisfaction with their status quo. "You seemed content with just the 2 of us," she'd written after he'd declined to pursue adoption. "So I stopped pushing, stopped hoping out loud. But Bear, this house echoes with the ghosts of children we'll never have. Sometimes I walk through the bedrooms upstairs and imagine them filled with small voices, with the beautiful chaos of family life. I decorate them in my mind: blue for a boy who loves horses like his father, pink for a girl who might help me in the garden. But they remain empty, and I remain silent, because I love you too much to burden you with dreams you don't seem to share." The later letters showed Sarah's growing acceptance, but also her increasing loneliness. She'd thrown herself into community work, helping other families with their children, becoming the unofficial grandmother to half the county while aching for grandchildren of her own. The last letter, written just months before her cancer diagnosis, nearly destroyed him. "I've made my peace with being childless, Bear, but I haven't made peace with leaving you alone in this big house. When I'm gone and the doctors say it won't be long now, you'll rattle around these rooms like a ghost. Promise me you won't let grief make you into a hermit. Promise me you'll find a way to fill this house with the life we never managed to create together. It doesn't have to be your own children, my darling. Love has many forms, and family isn't always about blood. This house was built for laughter and warmth and the beautiful mess of people who care about each other. Don't let it become a monument to what we lost. Let it become a celebration of what's still possible." Bear sat in his study for 2 hours, reading and rereading Sarah's secret correspondence. With each letter, his understanding of their marriage shifted and realigned. Sarah hadn't been content with their childless life. She'd been protecting him from her own disappointed hopes. She hadn't been uninterested in expanding their family. She'd been waiting for him to show interest first. All those years, they'd been dancing around the same desire, each trying to shield the other from disappointment while sacrificing their own dreams in the process. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah would have embraced Evelyn and her grandchildren without hesitation. She would have seen them as the answer to prayers she'd been too afraid to voice. The family that had appeared in Bear's life 3 months after Sarah's death was exactly what she'd been hoping for, a way to fill their house with love and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family life. When Evelyn arrived for work that Tuesday morning, she found Bear in the kitchen with red-rimmed eyes and 17 letters spread across the table. Her professional distance melted at the sight of his obvious distress. "Bear, what's wrong?" "I found some letters from Sarah. Things she never told me." His voice was rough with emotion. "Things that change everything I thought I knew about our marriage." Evelyn approached carefully, respecting his grief while offering her presence as comfort. "Do you want to talk about it?" Bear looked up at this woman who had become so much more than his housekeeper, who had brought life back to rooms that Sarah had dreamed of filling with children. The timing felt like destiny, or Sarah's gentle hand guiding him toward the family she'd always wanted him to have. She wanted children, desperately. She lost 4 babies over the years, and never told me because she thought I was content with just the 2 of us. Bear gestured to the letters. All those times I thought she wasn't interested in adoption or fostering, she was waiting for me to suggest it first. Evelyn's hand went to her throat, understanding the magnitude of missed communication. Oh, Bear. She wrote that she wanted me to fill this house with family after she was gone. Not necessarily my own children, but family, people to love and be loved by. Bear looked directly at Evelyn. She would have adored you, and the children. She would have welcomed you with open arms. Bear, I know what you're thinking, that I'm projecting, that I'm using Sarah's memory to justify what I want to do. But it's not that simple. Bear picked up the last letter, the one that had shattered and rebuilt his understanding of love and family. She wrote this knowing she was dying, knowing I'd be alone in this house. She begged me not to let grief make me a hermit. She wanted this place to become a celebration of what's still possible. Evelyn sat down across from him, her eyes soft with compassion. What are you saying? I'm saying that buying your land isn't about charity or guilt, or even my own loneliness. It's about honoring the dreams Sarah carried in secret for 20 years. It's about creating the family she always wanted us to have. Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of children's voices drifted through the house. Bear looked confused until he realized it was Tuesday. School was closed for teacher conferences, and Evelyn had brought the children with her to work. Anna had another cough last night, Evelyn explained. I didn't want to leave her alone, and the others insisted on coming along to help. As if summoned by their conversation, Aina appeared in the kitchen doorway, her small face lighting up when she saw Bear. Bear, we came to help Abuela clean. Tommy's going to fix that loose board on your porch, and I'm going to dust all the low places. Behind her, the twins and Carlos emerged, along with Tommy carrying a toolbox they'd borrowed from their line shack. The children greeted Bear with the easy affection they'd developed during their stay, transforming his quiet kitchen into a hub of activity and warmth. Bear watched Evelyn organize her small workforce, assigning age-appropriate tasks with the efficient grace of someone who'd been managing a household for decades. This was what Sarah had envisioned, not just children in the house, but a family working together, caring for each other and the home they shared. Evelyn, he said quietly, pulling her aside while the children dispersed to their various jobs. I need to show you something. He led her to his study and opened the ranch ledgers, showing her the financial records that detailed his true wealth. She'd known he was successful, but the numbers told a different story, one of generational wealth that would dwarf any normal person's understanding of financial security. This is why I can buy your land without thinking twice about the cost, Bear said. It's not a sacrifice or a burden, it's barely a rounding error in my annual budget. Evelyn stared at the figures, overwhelmed by the magnitude of resources at Bear's disposal. I had no idea. Most people don't. I don't live flashy or throw money around, but the truth is, I have more than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. Bear closed the ledger. So when I offer to buy your land, it's not about putting myself out or expecting gratitude. It's about using resources I have to solve a problem you have. But what do you get out of it? Bear thought about Sarah's letters, about the empty rooms upstairs, about the sound of Anna's laughter echoing through hallways that had known only silence for too long. I get to stop feeling like my wife died, disappointed in the life we built together. I get to honor her memory by creating the family she always wanted us to have. And maybe, he paused, looking toward the kitchen, where the children's voices created a symphony of belonging, maybe I get to stop being a rich man living like a poor one. That afternoon, while the children played in the snow and Evelyn prepared lunch, Bear called his lawyer. The purchase of the settlement land could be completed within a week. The rebuilding of the line shack could begin as soon as spring weather permitted, and Sarah's dream of a house filled with family could finally become reality. But first, he had to convince Evelyn that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom, that some gifts came with no strings attached, except the hope that they would create happiness for everyone involved. As evening approached and the family prepared to return to their cramped temporary shelter, Bear made a decision that would force the issue once and for all. "I bought the land," he told Evelyn as she gathered the children's coats. "James filed the paperwork this afternoon. It's done." Evelyn went very still. "Without my permission." "Without your permission," Bear confirmed, "because you never would have given it, and because sometimes the right thing is more important than proper protocol." The children, sensing adult tension, grew quiet. Bear knelt down to their level, speaking to them directly. "I bought the land where your house sits so that you'll never have to worry about having a place to live. It belongs to all of you now, Tommy, Maria, Rosa, Carlos, and Anna. When you grow up, it will be yours to do with as you please. In the meantime, your grandmother has the right to live there and make decisions about your home." "Really?" Anna's eyes were wide with wonder. "It's really ours?" "Really and truly, forever and always." The children erupted in excited chatter, but Bear's attention was focused on Evelyn, whose face had gone through a series of emotions: anger, shock, resignation, and finally, something that might have been relief. "You had no right," she said quietly. "You're absolutely correct. I had no legal right, no moral authority, and no permission. I did it anyway because I couldn't stand to watch your family face homelessness when I had the power to prevent it." Evelyn looked at her grandchildren, who were already making plans for their real house, their voices bright with the security they'd never known before. When she turned back to Bear, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "This changes everything between us." "Yes," Bear agreed. "It does. The question is whether it changes things for better or worse." As the family left that evening, Bear stood in his doorway and watched their taillights disappear into the darkness. Tomorrow, Evelyn would either forgive him for his high-handed intervention, or she would find a way to maintain her independence despite his actions. Either way, Sarah's dream was one step closer to reality. The children would never be homeless again, and Bear had honored his wife's final wish for their house to become a celebration of what was still possible. Now he just had to hope that Evelyn would eventually understand that some gifts were meant to create freedom, not obligation. The original land deed to Evelyn's property lay spread across Bear's kitchen table like an ancient treasure map, its edges yellowed with age and corners softened by decades of handling. James Morrison had delivered it personally, along with a folder thick with legal documents that would transfer ownership to a trust established for Evelyn's grandchildren. The railroad acquired this land in 1923, James explained, adjusting his reading glasses. "Bought it from the original homesteader's widow when she couldn't pay the taxes. Been sitting on their books ever since, waiting for the right development opportunity." Bear studied the deed's faded ink, tracing the property boundaries with his finger. 2 acres that had sheltered desperate families for nearly a century, now rescued from corporate indifference by his checkbook and stubborn determination. "The trust is structured exactly as you requested," James continued. "Equal ownership for all 5 children when they reach majority, with Evelyn maintaining life rights to the property. She can live there as long as she chooses, make improvements, even build a new house if she wants to. And she can't refuse it? Can't give it back? Not without unanimous consent from all 5 children when they come of age. You've essentially made it impossible for her pride to override their security." Bear nodded, satisfied with the legal maneuvering that would protect Evelyn from her own fierce independence. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights crafting this solution, finding a way to help her family without making her feel like a charity case. "There's one more thing," James said, pulling a final document from his briefcase. "The building permits for the new house. I took the liberty of expediting them through the county office. Construction can begin as soon as the weather breaks." Bear looked at the permits, seeing official validation of his plans to replace the crumbling line shack with a home worthy of Evelyn's family. The blueprints he'd drawn by lamplight were slowly becoming reality through legal documents and bureaucratic approvals. The original land deed to Evelyn's property lay spread across Bear's kitchen table like an ancient treasure map, its edges yellowed with age and corners softened by decades of handling. James Morrison had delivered it personally, along with a folder thick with legal documents that would transfer ownership to a trust established for Evelyn's grandchildren. The railroad acquired this land in 1923, James explained, adjusting his reading glasses. Bought it from the original homesteader's widow when she couldn't pay the taxes. Been sitting on their books ever since, waiting for the right development opportunity. Bear studied the deed's faded ink, tracing the property boundaries with his finger. 2 acres that had sheltered desperate families for nearly a century, now rescued from corporate indifference by his checkbook and stubborn determination. The trust is structured exactly as you requested, James continued. Equal ownership for all 5 children when they reach majority, with Evelyn maintaining life rights to the property. She can live there as long as she chooses, make improvements, even build a new house if she wants to. And she can't refuse it? Can't give it back? Not without unanimous consent from all 5 children when they come of age. You've essentially made it impossible for her pride to override their security. Bear nodded, satisfied with the legal maneuvering that would protect Evelyn from her own fierce independence. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights crafting this solution, finding a way to help her family without making her feel like a charity case. There's one more thing, James said, pulling a final document from his briefcase. The building permits for the new house. I took the liberty of expediting them through the county office. Construction can begin as soon as the weather breaks. Bear looked at the permits, seeing official validation of his plans to replace the crumbling line shack with a home worthy of Evelyn's family. The blueprints he'd drawn by lamplight were slowly becoming reality through legal documents and bureaucratic approvals. After James left, Bear sat alone with the deed and permits, feeling the weight of decisions that would change 6 lives forever. In 3 days, he would present these documents to Evelyn and her grandchildren. In 3 days, he would discover whether his actions represented salvation or betrayal in Evelyn's eyes. The next morning brought news that made Bear's stomach clench with anxiety. Tom Henley called from the general store with information that traveled fast in small towns. Railroad's been asking questions about the settlement land, Tom said without preamble. Sent a surveyor out yesterday to mark the boundaries. Word is they're planning to bulldoze the whole area next week. Bear's jaw tightened. I thought they were selling the parcels individually. Changed their minds, apparently. Found a developer willing to buy the whole tract for a freight depot, more profitable than piecemeal sales. What about the families still living there? Eviction notices went out this morning. Everyone's got 48 hours to clear out. Bear hung up the phone and immediately called James Morrison. The lawyer's voice carried grim certainty when he explained the legal situation. They can do it, Barrett. The original eviction notices gave 30 days, but they can accelerate the timeline with proper notice. 48 hours is legal if they're compensating for reasonable moving expenses. What about our purchase? We have a signed agreement. Not yet executed. Until the deed transfer is recorded with the county, the railroad maintains ownership and can change their minds about the sale. Bear felt panic rising in his throat. After everything, the careful planning, the legal maneuvering, the trust structure designed to protect Evelyn's pride, bureaucratic timing, might destroy it all. Can we expedite the recording? County office is closed until Monday. We're looking at 3 days minimum. 3 days. The railroad would bulldoze the settlement in 2 days, but Bear's purchase wouldn't be official for 3. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Evelyn and her family would be homeless before he could legally save them. Bear drove to the line shack that afternoon, the eviction notice crumpled in his jacket pocket. He found Evelyn in the yard, hanging laundry on the rope line while the children played in the snow nearby. Her movements were controlled and efficient, but Bear could see the tension in her shoulders. You heard, he said without preamble. This morning, railroad man came by with the papers. Evelyn's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she pinned a shirt to the line. 8 hours to pack up and move on. Where will you go? There's a shelter in Casper. Takes families for short stays while they find permanent housing. Evelyn's words carried the brittle strength of someone who'd made peace with their worst-case scenario. It's not ideal, but the children will be warm and fed. Bear wanted to tell her about the land purchase, about the trust and the building permits, and the new house he planned to build. But without the recorded deed, his promises were just words. Until Monday, Evelyn's family was as vulnerable as they'd ever been. "What if I told you that wasn't necessary?" Evelyn stopped hanging clothes and looked at him directly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if there was another option? Something better than a shelter in Casper?" "Bear, we've had this conversation. I won't accept charity." "Not charity, a business arrangement." Bear pulled the blueprints from his truck, spreading them on the hood, where Evelyn could see the detailed plans for the new house. Her eyes widened as she took in the careful design, the attention to her family's specific needs. "I want to hire you," Bear said, "not just for cleaning, but as a full-time housekeeper and cook. The job comes with housing this house, built to these specifications, on land that will belong to your grandchildren." Evelyn studied the plans, her finger tracing the outline of the kitchen she dreamed of having. "Bear, this is too much." "It's exactly enough. I need someone to manage my household properly, someone who understands how to turn a house into a home. You need security for your family and meaningful work that pays a living wage." Bear pointed to specific features on the blueprints. "This isn't charity, Evelyn. This is the smartest business decision I've ever made. And if I say no, then you say no. But the Children's Trust Fund still exists. The land purchase still goes through, and they still have security for their future. The only difference is whether you're part of that future or not." Tommy appeared at Evelyn's side, drawn by the sight of the blueprints. His eyes went wide as he recognized the layout of their current home, transformed and expanded into something magnificent. "Is this our house?" he asked. "It could be," Bear said carefully, "if your grandmother agrees to work for me as a full-time employee." The other children gathered around the truck, chattering excitedly as they recognized familiar elements from the plans. Anna pointed to the small bedroom with the window seat, claiming it as her own. The twins argued good-naturedly about who would get the larger of the two shared spaces. Carlos examined the kitchen with the serious attention of someone who understood the importance of adequate workspace. "Abuela," Maria said, tugging on Evelyn's coat, "can we really live here, in a real house with real rooms?" Bear watched Evelyn's face as she looked at her grandchildren, seeing their hope and excitement, their desperate desire for the security he was offering. This was the moment when her pride would either bend or break under the weight of their needs. "What exactly would this job entail?" she asked finally. "Managing the household, cooking, coordinating maintenance and repairs, overseeing any staff I might need to hire for seasonal work. Essentially, you'd be running the domestic side of the ranch operation." "And the salary?" Bear named a figure that made Evelyn's eyes widen. It was generous enough to ensure her dignity while providing genuine financial security for the first time in years. "That's too much for housekeeping work." "It's exactly right for the work I'm describing. You wouldn't just be cleaning, Evelyn. You'd be managing a complex household and helping me turn my house into a home. That's worth every penny I'm offering." Evelyn looked at the blueprints again, then at her grandchildren's hopeful faces, then at the eviction notice still clutched in her other hand. Bear could see the war between pride and pragmatism playing out in her expression. "I need conditions," she said finally. "Name them." "I work for my wages. No special treatment, no favors because of the children. If I don't perform to your standards, you can fire me like any other employee." "Agreed." The children pull their weight. They do chores, help with maintenance, earn their place here through contribution, not charity. "Absolutely. And if this arrangement doesn't work out, if we're not compatible as employer and employee, I need your word that you won't revoke the children's trust or take back the land." Bear met her eyes directly. "You have my word. Whatever happens between us, the children's security is guaranteed." Evelyn looked around at the crumbling line shack, at the poverty her family had endured with such dignity, at the uncertain future that had kept her awake for months. Then she looked at this man who'd stumbled into their lives and refused to let them face disaster alone. "All right," she said quietly, "I accept your offer." The children erupted in cheers, but Bear barely heard them. He was focused on Evelyn's face, on the mixture of relief and terror in her eyes, as she committed to a future she'd never dared to dream possible. "When do we start?" she asked. "Right now. Pack whatever you need for a few days. You're all staying at the lodge until the new house is built. Consider it part of the job. I need you available for household management, which means living where the household is." As the family hurried to pack their essential belongings, Bear felt the pieces of his plan clicking into place. By Monday, the deed would be recorded, and Evelyn's land would be legally secure. By spring, construction would begin on a house designed specifically for her family's needs, and starting tonight, his empty lodge would ring with the sounds Sarah had always dreamed of hearing. The railroad could bulldoze the empty settlement if they wanted to. The line shack could fall to progress and corporate efficiency. But the family that had sheltered there would never be homeless again, and Bear's house would finally become the home it was always meant to be. As they loaded the last of the belongings into his truck, Anna tugged on Bear's coat sleeve. "Bear," she said solemnly, "are you sure you want all of us living in your house? We can be pretty loud sometimes." Bear knelt down to her level, thinking about Sarah's letters and empty rooms, and the sound of loneliness that had echoed through his halls for 3 years. "Sweetheart," he said, "I've been waiting my whole life for the right kind of loud." That evening, as the family settled into their rooms at the lodge, this time permanently, Bear stood in his kitchen and listened to the beautiful chaos of dinner preparation. Evelyn moved through the space with the confidence of someone who belonged there, directing her grandchildren in setting the table and finishing homework while she cooked. This was what Sarah had envisioned when she'd written about filling their house with family. This was the celebration of what was still possible, the proof that love came in many forms and family wasn't always about blood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, adjusting to shared space, negotiating boundaries, learning to live as an unconventional but committed family unit. But tonight, Bear's house was full of warmth and laughter, and the promise of second chances for everyone who lived within its walls. Sarah's engagement ring sat in Bear's palm, like a promise waiting to be renewed. He'd carried it in his jacket pocket for 3 days, the small velvet box, a constant reminder of the decision he needed to make. The ring was a simple solitaire, chosen by a young man who'd had more love than money, worn by a woman who'd treasured it more than any elaborate jewel. Now, sitting in his study while the sound of family life drifted through the house, Bear contemplated offering it to another woman who understood that true wealth had nothing to do with money. 2 weeks had passed since Evelyn and the children moved into the lodge permanently. The adjustment period had been easier than Bear expected, perhaps because they all wanted it to work so desperately. Evelyn managed the household with quiet efficiency, transforming daily routines into small celebrations. The children had adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of youth, claiming spaces and establishing patterns that made the house feel truly lived in. But underneath the domestic harmony, Bear sensed that Evelyn was still holding something back. She performed her duties perfectly, maintained professional boundaries, and treated their arrangement as exactly what she'd insisted it, be business relationship between employer and employee. Only in unguarded moments did he catch glimpses of the woman who'd shared coffee with him in the line shack, who'd let him see her vulnerability during the storm. A knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. "Bear?" Evelyn's voice carried its usual careful politeness. "Dinner's ready." "Coming." Bear tucked the ring box back into his pocket and joined the family in the dining room. The evening meal had become Bear's favorite time of day. The formal dining room, unused for years except when entertaining business associates, now hosted nightly gatherings around the long oak table. Tonight, like every night, the children shared stories from school, while Evelyn orchestrated the complex choreography of feeding 5 young people with varying tastes and dietary restrictions. "Mr. Henderson says I might be able to skip a grade in math," Carlos announced between bites of pot roast. He thinks I could handle algebra if I work with a tutor this summer. That's wonderful, Bear said, genuinely pleased. We'll make sure you get that tutoring. I don't want charity, Carlos said, echoing his grandmother's pride with startling directness. It's not charity, it's investment. Education pays dividends for everyone involved. Evelyn looked up from cutting Anna's meat, surprise flickering across her features. That's very generous of you. It's practical. Carlos has a good mind for mathematics. Helping him develop that skill benefits everyone in the long run. After dinner, while the children dispersed to their homework and evening activities, Bear found himself alone with Evelyn in the kitchen. She moved through the cleanup routine with practiced efficiency, but he noticed the way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. "Evelyn," he said, hanging up the dish towel, "can we talk?" She stiffened slightly. "Is there a problem with my work?" "No, your work is perfect. Maybe too perfect." "I don't understand." Bear leaned against the counter, studying her carefully controlled expression. "You've been here 2 weeks, and you still act like you're expecting me to change my mind about this arrangement. Like you're afraid that if you get too comfortable, I'll suddenly remember this is all too good to be true." Evelyn's hands stilled on the dishes. "Isn't it? Isn't what too good to be true? All of this, the job, the house, the security for the children. Rich men don't usually rescue poor families out of the goodness of their hearts. There's always a price, even if it's not discussed up front." Bear felt something twist in his chest. "What price do you think I'm expecting?" Evelyn finally looked at him directly, her brown eyes filled with a wariness that spoke of hard experience. "I don't know yet. But I've learned that when something seems too generous, too perfect, it's because I don't understand what's really being asked of me." "And what do you think might be asked of you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Bear saw the moment when Evelyn realized the conversation had moved beyond employer-employee boundaries into more dangerous territory. "I should finish cleaning the kitchen," she said, turning back to the sink. "Evelyn," Bear's voice was gentle but insistent. "What if the only price was honesty? What if I told you that I don't want a housekeeper who maintains professional distance? What if I said I want the woman who shared coffee with me during snowstorms and let me see her real thoughts?" That woman was desperate. She needed help more than she needed pride. "And this woman, what does she need?" Evelyn's shoulders sagged slightly, some of her careful control slipping away. "Security, stability, the knowledge that my grandchildren will never be homeless again. You have that. The legal documents guarantee it." "Legal documents can be challenged. Circumstances can change." Evelyn turned to face him again. "You could decide tomorrow that this arrangement isn't working, that having a family in your house is more trouble than it's worth. And then where would we be?" Bear understood then that Evelyn's careful distance wasn't about maintaining professionalism, it was about protecting herself and the children from the devastation of losing this security once they'd grown to depend on it. "You're right," he said quietly. "I could change my mind. I could decide this arrangement doesn't work and end your employment. But Evelyn, the children's trust fund is irrevocable. The land belongs to them forever, regardless of what happens between us. Even if I fired you tomorrow, they would still have a place to live and money for their education. But I would have failed them again, lost another home, another chance at stability. No." Bear moved closer, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "You would have given them more than most children ever have, a future that doesn't depend on anyone else's continued goodwill." Evelyn looked at him with something that might have been hope, carefully restrained by experience. "You make it sound simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we've been making it complicated because we're both afraid of wanting something that seems too good to be true." Before Evelyn could respond, Anna appeared in the kitchen doorway, clutching her restored family photograph and wearing pajamas decorated with horses. "Abuela, I can't find my tooth that came out. The tooth fairy won't know where to look if I can't put it under my pillow." Evelyn immediately shifted into grandmother mode, helping Anna search for the missing tooth, while Bear watched their easy intimacy with something approaching envy. This was what he wanted, not just a well-managed household, but the warmth of family connections, the privilege of being included in small daily dramas and celebrations. They found the tooth in Anna's bedroom, wedged between the mattress and bed frame. As Evelyn tucked the little girl into bed, Anna looked up at Bear with sleepy curiosity. "Bear, do you believe in the tooth fairy?" Bear glanced at Evelyn, who was trying not to smile. "I believe in magic that makes children happy." "Good, because sometimes grown-ups forget about magic, and that makes the tooth fairy sad." After Anna was settled, Bear and Evelyn returned to the kitchen to finish their interrupted conversation. But the moment felt different now, gentler somehow, influenced by the domestic intimacy they'd just shared. "She's getting attached to you," Evelyn said softly. "They all are. Is that a problem?" "It is if you're not equally attached to them." Bear thought about the question seriously, examining his feelings for these 5 children who'd transformed his house into a home. Tommy's quiet maturity and sense of responsibility. The twins' spirited arguments and fierce loyalty to each other. Carlos's intellectual curiosity and determination to excel. Anna's open-hearted trust and ability to find wonder in everyday moments. "I am attached," he said finally. "More than I expected to be. More than is probably wise." "Why isn't it wise?" "Because I don't know how to be a father figure. I don't know if I can give them what they need." Evelyn studied his face, reading the uncertainty he rarely let others see. "You're already giving them what they need most: security, stability, and someone who cares about their future. The rest you can learn as you go." "What about what I need?" The question slipped out before Bear could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. "What do you need?" Bear pulled out the ring box, setting it on the counter between them. Evelyn's eyes widened as she recognized what it represented. "I need to stop feeling like a man who's living in the shadow of his own life. I need to believe that second chances are possible, that people can build new families from the pieces of old ones." Bear opened the box, revealing Sarah's simple engagement ring. "I need to know if you think you could ever see me as more than just your employer." Evelyn stared at the ring, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been longing. "Bear, I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm just asking you to think about it, to consider the possibility that what we've built here could be more than a business arrangement. The children love you and need you just like I do. We could be a real family, Evelyn. Not perfect, not traditional, but real." Evelyn touched the ring box with one finger, as if testing whether it was real or just another too-good-to-be-true dream. "This is Sarah's ring." "Yes, and I think she would want it to represent new love, not just the memory of old love." Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Tommy's arrival in the kitchen. The teenager stopped short when he saw the ring box, his eyes moving between Bear and his grandmother with dawning understanding. "Am I interrupting something important?" Tommy asked, with the careful politeness that marked all his interactions with Bear. "We were just talking," Evelyn said, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested the conversation had been far from casual. Tommy looked at the ring again, then at Bear. "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you planning to marry my grandmother?" The directness of the question caught both adults off guard. Bear glanced at Evelyn, who was looking at her grandson with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity about his response. "I'm hoping she'll consider it," Bear said honestly, "but that's her decision to make." Tommy nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness of someone who'd learned to be protective of his family's welfare. "Would that make you our grandfather?" "It would make me your step-grandfather, yes, if that's something you'd be comfortable with." "And we'd stay here? This would really be our home?" "Forever," Bear confirmed, "regardless of what your grandmother decides about marriage." Tommy looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their new life, taking in the evidence of security and stability that had seemed impossible just months ago. When he looked back at Bear, his expression held a maturity that went far beyond his 15 years. "I think," Tommy said carefully, "that you should ask her properly, with flowers and stuff. Grandmothers like flowers. With that pronouncement, Tommy headed back upstairs, leaving Bear and Evelyn alone with the weight of possibility hanging between them. "Well," Bear said after a moment, "I believe I've just been given permission to court you properly." Evelyn laughed despite her nervousness, and the sound transformed her face from careful control to genuine warmth. "He's right about the flowers. I do like flowers." Bear picked up the ring box and tucked it back into his pocket. "Then I'd better start planning properly. This is too important to do halfway." As they finished cleaning the kitchen together, Bear felt the first stirrings of real hope. Evelyn hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. And for the first time since Sarah's death, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. The new family portrait arrived on a crisp February morning, delivered by the photographer who'd captured their first formal family picture the week before. Bear held the framed photograph in his hands, studying the faces that had become so precious to him, Evelyn in the center, dignified and beautiful, surrounded by her 5 grandchildren who were finally allowed to smile without worry. And there, standing beside them with his hand on Tommy's shoulder, was Bear himself, looking more content than he had in years. It had been 3 weeks since he'd shown Evelyn the engagement ring, 3 weeks of careful courtship that felt both natural and terrifying. True to Tommy's advice, Bear had brought flowers not just once, but daily, filling the house with daffodils and tulips that spoke of spring and new beginnings. He'd also brought small gifts for the children, not expensive items, but thoughtful tokens that showed he was learning their individual interests and personalities. For Carlos, a set of advanced mathematics books. For the twins, matching lockets with pictures of their parents. For Anna, a dollhouse that was an exact replica of the lodge, complete with tiny furniture for every room. For Tommy, a leather-bound journal and a promise to teach him ranch management when he was ready. But it was the everyday moments that had truly won Evelyn's heart. Bear, reading bedtime stories to Anna, helping Carlos with algebra, mediating disputes between the twins with patient wisdom, and treating Tommy like the young man he was becoming rather than the child he no longer was. "It's perfect," Evelyn said, looking over Bear's shoulder at the photograph. "We look like we belong together." "We do belong together." Bear set the picture on the mantelpiece, where it would be the first thing visitors saw when they entered the house. "The question is whether you're ready to make it official." Evelyn had been avoiding that conversation for weeks, and they both knew it. Every time Bear attempted to discuss marriage, she found reasons to postpone the decision. There were the children's school schedules to consider, the construction timeline for the new house, the need to establish routines in their current living situation. All legitimate concerns, but Bear sensed they were also excuses to avoid confronting her own fears about remarriage. "Abuela," Anna called from the kitchen, "the pancakes are getting cold." They joined the family for Sunday breakfast, a leisurely meal that had become Bear's favorite weekly tradition. The dining room buzzed with conversation as the children made plans for the day. Tommy wanted to help Bear check cattle. The twins were organizing a sledding expedition. Carlos had a science project to finish, and Anna was determined to build a snow fort that could withstand any siege. "What about you?" Bear asked Evelyn as the children dispersed to their various activities. "Any plans for this beautiful Sunday?" "Laundry, meal planning for the week, the usual domestic tasks." "What if I suggested something different?" Evelyn looked at him suspiciously. "Like what?" "A drive. Just the 2 of us. There's something I want to show you." An hour later, they were heading east in Bear's truck, driving through landscape that was beginning to show the first hints of approaching spring. Snow still covered the ground, but the sun was warmer, and Bear had spotted crocuses pushing through the earth near the barn. "Where are we going?" Evelyn asked, as they turned onto the familiar road that led to the old settlement. "You'll see." When they reached the site where the line shack had stood, Evelyn gasped. The crumbling structure was gone, bulldozed away as promised, but in its place rose the frame of a new house. Bear's blueprints had become reality: sturdy walls, a stone foundation, windows positioned to catch morning light and evening breezes. Construction started last week, Bear explained as they climbed out of the truck. The contractor says we'll have it enclosed by April, finished by midsummer. Evelyn walked through the framed rooms, her fingers trailing along the wooden studs that marked where walls would stand. Bear followed, pointing out features as they explored their future home together. This will be the kitchen, with the island you wanted for homework supervision. The living room opens to it here, so you can keep an eye on everything while you cook. He led her to the back of the house. Master bedroom with windows facing the mountains. And here, Bear opened a door that led to a small room with its own entrance. Your sewing room. I noticed you like to mend and alter the children's clothes. Bear. Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. This is beautiful, but it's not mine. It will be. The trust documents include provisions for the house once it's completed. It belongs to the children, which means it belongs to you for as long as you need it. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, where 5 bedrooms waited to be finished. Each room was designed for a specific child, incorporating details Bear had learned from watching their habits and preferences. Anna's room had a built-in window seat for reading. The twins' rooms were connected by a shared bathroom, but separate enough for privacy as they grew older. Carlos's room included built-in bookcases and a study nook. Tommy's room was larger, with space for the young man he was becoming. There's one more thing, Bear said, leading Evelyn to a small balcony that overlooked the valley. A place to sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. I thought you might like that. Evelyn gripped the railing, looking out over land that would belong to her grandchildren forever. When she turned back to Bear, tears were streaming down her face. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing all this? Bear pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, dropping to one knee on the unfinished balcony with the Wyoming wind whipping around them. Because I love you. Because I love the children. Because this house should be filled with the family Sarah always dreamed we'd have. Bear. Let me finish. Bear opened the ring box, revealing Sarah's simple solitaire. I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt before, that you've learned not to trust when things seem too good to be true. But Evelyn, some gifts don't come with hidden prices. Some love is exactly what it appears to be. Evelyn looked down at him, this man who'd stumbled into her life and refused to let her family face disaster alone. What if I'm not ready? What if I can't be the wife you deserve? You're already everything I need. You've brought my house back to life, shown me how to be part of a family again, taught me that wealth means nothing without people to share it with. Bear's voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Marry me, Evelyn. Let's make this official. Let's give the children the security of legal family bonds and ourselves the joy of a love that doesn't have to hide behind employment contracts. Evelyn looked at the ring, then at the house taking shape around them, then at Bear's face, which showed nothing but honest devotion and hope. The children already consider me family. Tommy asked me last week if he could call me Grandpa Bear after we're married. And if it doesn't work, if we discover we're not compatible as husband and wife, then we'll figure it out together, like families do. But Evelyn, I'd rather risk failure trying to build something real than guarantee loneliness by never trying at all. Evelyn closed her eyes, and Bear held his breath, waiting for the decision that would determine the rest of their lives. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with tears and something that looked like joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Bear slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been meant for her all along. Then he stood and kissed her, properly and thoroughly, while the Wyoming wind sang around them and their future home rose from the foundation of their shared hopes. When they broke apart, Evelyn was laughing through her tears. The children are going to be impossible when they find out. Good. This house needs to be full of celebration. They spent another hour walking through the construction site, planning details and discussing timelines. The house would be ready by summer, but their wedding could happen sooner. Much sooner, if the children had anything to say about it. On the drive back to the lodge, Evelyn held up her hand to catch the afternoon light on Sarah's ring. Do you think she would approve? I think she's been orchestrating this from the beginning. The timing of when you appeared in my life, the way the children fit so perfectly into the spaces she always wanted to fill, that's not coincidence. That's Sarah, making sure her dreams finally came true. When they arrived home, the children were waiting in the kitchen, their faces bright with curiosity about the mysterious drive. Anna spotted the ring first, her gasp of delight alerting the others to examine Evelyn's left hand. "You're getting married," Anna shrieked, launching herself into Bear's arms. "Are we going to have a wedding, with flowers and cake?" "The biggest wedding this county has ever seen," Bear promised, lifting the little girl and spinning her around. "If that's what your grandmother wants." Tommy approached more solemnly, but his smile was genuine as he shook Bear's hand. "Congratulations, sir. You're getting the best grandmother in Wyoming." "I know," Bear said seriously. "I'm the luckiest man alive." As the family celebrated around them, Bear caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen. She was watching her grandchildren with an expression of pure joy, finally allowing herself to believe in the security and happiness that had seemed impossible just months ago. This was what Bear had been missing all his life, not just the love of a good woman, but the privilege of being part of something larger than himself. A family built not just on blood, but on choice and commitment, and the daily decision to care for each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The new family portrait arrived on a crisp February morning, delivered by the photographer who'd captured their first formal family picture the week before. Bear held the framed photograph in his hands, studying the faces that had become so precious to him, Evelyn in the center, dignified and beautiful, surrounded by her 5 grandchildren who were finally allowed to smile without worry. And there, standing beside them with his hand on Tommy's shoulder, was Bear himself, looking more content than he had in years. It had been 3 weeks since he'd shown Evelyn the engagement ring, 3 weeks of careful courtship that felt both natural and terrifying. True to Tommy's advice, Bear had brought flowers not just once, but daily, filling the house with daffodils and tulips that spoke of spring and new beginnings. He'd also brought small gifts for the children, not expensive items, but thoughtful tokens that showed he was learning their individual interests and personalities. For Carlos, a set of advanced mathematics books. For the twins, matching lockets with pictures of their parents. For Anna, a dollhouse that was an exact replica of the lodge, complete with tiny furniture for every room. For Tommy, a leather-bound journal and a promise to teach him ranch management when he was ready. But it was the everyday moments that had truly won Evelyn's heart. Bear, reading bedtime stories to Anna, helping Carlos with algebra, mediating disputes between the twins with patient wisdom, and treating Tommy like the young man he was becoming rather than the child he no longer was. "It's perfect," Evelyn said, looking over Bear's shoulder at the photograph. "We look like we belong together." "We do belong together." Bear set the picture on the mantelpiece, where it would be the first thing visitors saw when they entered the house. "The question is whether you're ready to make it official." Evelyn had been avoiding that conversation for weeks, and they both knew it. Every time Bear attempted to discuss marriage, she found reasons to postpone the decision. There were the children's school schedules to consider, the construction timeline for the new house, the need to establish routines in their current living situation. All legitimate concerns, but Bear sensed they were also excuses to avoid confronting her own fears about remarriage. "Abuela," Anna called from the kitchen, "the pancakes are getting cold." They joined the family for Sunday breakfast, a leisurely meal that had become Bear's favorite weekly tradition. The dining room buzzed with conversation as the children made plans for the day. Tommy wanted to help Bear check cattle. The twins were organizing a sledding expedition. Carlos had a science project to finish, and Anna was determined to build a snow fort that could withstand any siege. "What about you?" Bear asked Evelyn, as the children dispersed to their various activities. "Any plans for this beautiful Sunday?" "Laundry, meal planning for the week, the usual domestic tasks." "What if I suggested something different?" Evelyn looked at him suspiciously. "Like what?" "A drive, just the two of us. There's something I want to show you." An hour later, they were heading east in Bear's truck, driving through landscape that was beginning to show the first hints of approaching spring. Snow still covered the ground, but the sun was warmer, and Bear had spotted crocuses pushing through the earth near the barn. "Where are we going?" Evelyn asked, as they turned onto the familiar road that led to the old settlement. "You'll see." When they reached the site where the line shack had stood, Evelyn gasped. The crumbling structure was gone, bulldozed away as promised, but in its place rose the frame of a new house. Bear's blueprints had become reality-sturdy walls, a stone foundation, windows positioned to catch morning light and evening breezes. "Construction started last week," Bear explained as they climbed out of the truck. "The contractor says we'll have it enclosed by April, finished by midsummer." Evelyn walked through the framed rooms, her fingers trailing along the wooden studs that marked where walls would stand. Bear followed, pointing out features as they explored their future home together. "This will be the kitchen, with the island you wanted for homework supervision. The living room opens to it here, so you can keep an eye on everything while you cook." He led her to the back of the house. "Master bedroom, with windows facing the mountains. And here," Bear opened a door that led to a small room with its own entrance. "Your sewing room. I noticed you like to mend and alter the children's clothes." "Bear." Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. "This is beautiful, but it's not mine." "It will be. The trust documents include provisions for the house once it's completed. It belongs to the children, which means it belongs to you for as long as you need it." They climbed the stairs to the second floor, where 5 bedrooms waited to be finished. Each room was designed for a specific child, incorporating details Bear had learned from watching their habits and preferences. Anna's room had a built-in window seat for reading. The twins' rooms were connected by a shared bathroom, but separate enough for privacy as they grew older. Carlos's room included built-in bookcases and a study nook. Tommy's room was larger, with space for the young man he was becoming. "There's one more thing," Bear said, leading Evelyn to a small balcony that overlooked the valley. "A place to sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. I thought you might like that." Evelyn gripped the railing, looking out over land that would belong to her grandchildren forever. When she turned back to Bear, tears were streaming down her face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing all this?" Bear pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, dropping to one knee on the unfinished balcony with the Wyoming wind whipping around them. "Because I love you. Because I love the children. Because this house should be filled with the family Sarah always dreamed we'd have." "Bear." "Let me finish." Bear opened the ring box, revealing Sarah's simple solitaire. "I know you're scared. I know you've been hurt before, that you've learned not to trust when things seem too good to be true. But Evelyn, some gifts don't come with hidden prices. Some love is exactly what it appears to be." Evelyn looked down at him, this man who'd stumbled into her life and refused to let her family face disaster alone. "What if I'm not ready? What if I can't be the wife you deserve? You're already everything I need. You've brought my house back to life, shown me how to be part of a family again, taught me that wealth means nothing without people to share it with." Bear's voice was steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Marry me, Evelyn. Let's make this official. Let's give the children the security of legal family bonds and ourselves the joy of a love that doesn't have to hide behind employment contracts." Evelyn looked at the ring, then at the house taking shape around them, then at Bear's face, which showed nothing but honest devotion and hope. "The children already consider me family. Tommy asked me last week if he could call me Grandpa Bear after we're married. And if it doesn't work, if we discover we're not compatible as husband and wife, then we'll figure it out together, like families do. But Evelyn, I'd rather risk failure trying to build something real than guarantee loneliness by never trying at all." Evelyn closed her eyes, and Bear held his breath, waiting for the decision that would determine the rest of their lives. When she opened her eyes again, they were bright with tears and something that looked like joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Bear slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been meant for her all along. Then he stood and kissed her, properly and thoroughly, while the Wyoming wind sang around them and their future home rose from the foundation of their shared hopes. When they broke apart, Evelyn was laughing through her tears. The children are going to be impossible when they find out. Good. This house needs to be full of celebration. They spent another hour walking through the construction site, planning details and discussing timelines. The house would be ready by summer, but their wedding could happen sooner. Much sooner, if the children had anything to say about it. On the drive back to the lodge, Evelyn held up her hand to catch the afternoon light on Sarah's ring. Do you think she would approve? I think she's been orchestrating this from the beginning. The timing of when you appeared in my life, the way the children fit so perfectly into the spaces she always wanted to fill, that's not coincidence. That's Sarah, making sure her dreams finally came true. When they arrived home, the children were waiting in the kitchen, their faces bright with curiosity about the mysterious drive. Anna spotted the ring first, her gasp of delight alerting the others to examine Evelyn's left hand. You're getting married, Anna shrieked, launching herself into Bear's arms. Are we going to have a wedding with flowers and cake? The biggest wedding this county has ever seen, Bear promised, lifting the little girl and spinning her around. If that's what your grandmother wants. Tommy approached more solemnly, but his smile was genuine as he shook Bear's hand. Congratulations, sir. You're getting the best grandmother in Wyoming. I know, Bear said seriously. I'm the luckiest man alive. As the family celebrated around them, Bear caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen. She was watching her grandchildren with an expression of pure joy, finally allowing herself to believe in the security and happiness that had seemed impossible just months ago. This was what Bear had been missing all his life, not just the love of a good woman, but the privilege of being part of something larger than himself. A family built not just on blood, but on choice and commitment, and the daily decision to care for each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah's ring caught the light on Evelyn's finger, and Bear could almost hear his first wife's gentle laughter mixing with the children's excited chatter. Two loves, separated by years and circumstances, but connected by the same dream of a house filled with family. Sarah's love had taught him how to love deeply. Evelyn's love was teaching him how to love again. The children immediately began planning the wedding with the enthusiasm only young people could bring to such an occasion. Anna insisted on being the flower girl, while the twins argued about who would be maid of honor. Carlos wanted to handle the photography, and Tommy gravely accepted the responsibility of walking his grandmother down the aisle. June, Evelyn said, when Bear asked about timing. After the children finish school, but before the new house is ready, I want our first home as a married couple to be in the lodge where this all began. June it is, Bear agreed, thinking about summer evenings on the porch, about the garden Evelyn wanted to plant, about growing old together, surrounded by the laughter of children and eventually grandchildren. That night, after the children were asleep and the excitement had settled into contented planning, Bear and Evelyn sat in the living room with coffee and the comfortable silence of two people who'd found their way home. Are you sure about this? Evelyn asked, turning Sarah's ring on her finger. Marriage is different from what we have now. There are expectations, responsibilities. The only expectation I have is that we'll face whatever comes together. The only responsibility I want is to love you and the children for as long as I'm alive. Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, and Bear felt the last of his loneliness fade away. This was what Sarah had wanted for him, not a shrine to their past, but a celebration of what was still possible. Love that honored what came before while embracing what lay ahead. Outside, Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees that had watched over this land for generations. Inside, a new family had found its way to each other through hope, determination, and the kind of love that made second chances feel like first blessings. 2 coffee cups sat on the kitchen table in the early morning light, steam rising from their contents like incense in a sacred ritual. Bear McAllister looked across at his wife of 3 months, watching as Evelyn planned the day ahead with the quiet efficiency he'd come to treasure. The transformation was complete, not just of his house, but of his entire understanding of what it meant to be wealthy. True wealth, he'd learned, was measured in morning conversations over shared coffee. It was found in the sound of children's voices echoing through hallways that had once known only silence. It was discovered in the privilege of being needed, wanted, and loved not for what he owned, but for who he'd chosen to become. The wedding had taken place in June, as planned, with the entire county invited to witness the union of two people who'd found each other when they'd both given up on fairy tales. Anna had indeed been the flower girl, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of someone fulfilling an important mission. Tommy had walked his grandmother down the aisle with the dignity of a young man who understood the significance of family bonds. The twins had served as joint maids of honor, while Carlos documented everything with the camera Bear had given him for the occasion. But the real magic hadn't been in the ceremony it's beautiful, as it was but in the months that followed, as they'd learned to navigate married life while raising 5 children who'd never known such security. The new house was finished now, a monument to careful planning and shared dreams. Evelyn and the children had moved in 2 weeks ago, officially ending their time as residents of the lodge. But they returned every day, because this was where the family business operated, where meals were shared, where homework was supervised and disputes mediated. Bear had insisted on maintaining his household management contract with Evelyn, not because he needed domestic help, but because he understood the importance of her maintaining financial independence within their marriage. She ran both households now, the lodge where he lived and worked, and the new house where she and the children slept each night, secure in the knowledge that it belonged to them forever. The contractor wants to start on the barn extension next week, Evelyn said, consulting the list she kept of ongoing projects. And Carlos needs new shoes again. That boy is growing faster than we can keep up with. Growing boys need good shoes, Bear said, making a mental note to take Carlos shopping. What about Tommy's college applications? Have the responses started coming in? 2 acceptances so far, both with scholarship offers. He's trying to decide between agricultural studies and business management. Bear smiled, remembering his conversations with Tommy about the future. The young man was torn between his love of the land and his desire to understand the financial side of ranch operations. Either choice would serve him well, and Bear had promised to support whatever path Tommy chose. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the twins, who appeared in the kitchen with their hair braided and their faces bright with anticipation. Summer vacation meant long days of freedom, and they'd developed an ambitious schedule of activities that kept everyone busy. "Morning, Grandpa Bear," Maria said, using the title that still made Bear's chest tighten with emotion. "Morning, girls. What's on the agenda today?" "Carlos wants to check the cattle with you," Rosa reported, "and Ana's still working on her garden. She says the tomatoes need encouragement." Bear laughed, thinking of 6-year-old Anna's serious approach to gardening. She'd planted a small plot behind the new house with Bear's help, and tended it with the devotion of someone who understood that growing things required patience and faith. "We should all encourage Anna's tomatoes," he said solemnly. "They're doing important work." Carlos appeared next, already dressed in boots and work clothes, carrying the notebook where he recorded his observations about ranch operations. At 9 years old, he showed the same intellectual curiosity that had impressed Bear from the beginning, but now it was focused on practical applications rather than just academic achievement. "I want to check the fence line in the north pasture," Carlos announced. "I think some of the posts might be loose after that last storm." "Good eye," Bear said, genuinely impressed. "We'll ride out after breakfast." Anna was the last to arrive, carrying her restored family photograph and wearing the serious expression that meant she had something important to discuss. She climbed into Bear's lap with the ease of a child who'd never known rejection, settling in as if the position had been designed specifically for her. "Bear," she said, using his name with the careful pronunciation that made it sound like a title of respect. "I've been thinking about families." "What about families?" "How they're made. Like, we weren't always a family, but now we are. And Mama and Papa aren't here anymore, but they're still part of our family because we remember them." Bear looked at the photograph Anna held, seeing Miguel and Carmen's faces alongside their children, understanding that this little girl was grappling with complex concepts about love and loss and the ways families evolved. "That's very wise thinking," Bear said carefully. "What conclusions have you reached?" "I think families are like gardens. You plant them with love, and if you take care of them every day, they grow into something beautiful. And even when some plants don't make it, they're still part of the garden because they help the soil get ready for what comes next." Evelyn paused in her breakfast preparations, her eyes bright with tears at her granddaughter's insight. Bear felt his own throat tighten as he considered the profound wisdom of Anna's garden metaphor. "I think you're absolutely right," he said. "Your mama and papa helped prepare the soil for this family, and now we all take care of each other so the garden keeps growing." Anna nodded, satisfied with this explanation. "That's why I talk to my tomatoes. I tell them about Mama and Papa, so they know they're part of our family garden too." After breakfast, the family dispersed to their various activities. Bear and Carlos rode out to check the north pasture, where the 9-year-old's observation about loose fence posts proved accurate. They spent the morning making repairs, with Carlos asking thoughtful questions about ranch management and property maintenance. "Why do you think Anna talks to plants?" Carlos asked as they reset a gatepost. "Maybe because she understands something adults sometimes forget, that love doesn't stop just because we can't see something anymore." Carlos considered this with the seriousness he brought to all complex problems. "Like how you still love Sarah even though you love Abuela now." The question caught Bear off guard with its directness, but he recognized Carlos's need for clarity about the emotional landscape of their blended family. "Exactly like that. Love isn't a limited resource, Carlos. Having more of it doesn't mean we have less for anyone else." That evening, as had become their tradition, the entire family gathered at the lodge for dinner. The dining room table accommodated all 7 of them comfortably, with conversation flowing around shared food and the day's accumulated stories. Tommy reported on his latest correspondence with college admissions officers. The twins described their afternoon spent teaching Anna to braid dandelions into crowns. Carlos shared his observations about cattle behavior and weather patterns. Anna provided a detailed update on her garden's progress, including her concerns about a tomato plant that seemed lonely. Bear listened to it all with the wonder of someone who'd discovered treasure in his own backyard. This was what Sarah had dreamed of when she'd designed this house, not just meals shared by family members, but the daily rhythm of people who cared about each other's joys and worries. After dinner, while the children scattered to evening activities, Bear and Evelyn took their coffee to the front porch, where they could watch the sun set over the mountains. It was a ritual they'd maintained since their marriage, this quiet time to reconnect after busy days filled with the beautiful chaos of family life. "Any regrets?" Bear asked, a question that had become their private check-in with each other. "Only that we waited so long to get started," Evelyn replied, settling into the chair that had become exclusively hers. "What about you?" Bear considered the question seriously, looking out over land that would belong to Evelyn's grandchildren, thinking about the new house that guaranteed their security, remembering the empty rooms that had once echoed with loneliness. "None," he said finally. "Not a single one." As darkness settled over the valley, lights came on in the new house where his family would sleep safely tonight. Bear could see Anna's bedroom window, where she'd insisted on a nightlight that cast star patterns on the ceiling. The twins' room glowed with the reading lamps they used for their evening chapter books. Carlos's window showed the desk light where he worked on projects that combined his love of learning with practical ranch applications. Tommy's room displayed the steady light of a young man planning his future. In 2 years, Tommy would leave for college, the first of Evelyn's grandchildren, to test his wings in the wider world. The twins would follow eventually, then Carlos, and finally Anna. But they would always have this place to return to, this land that belonged to them, this family that would welcome them home, no matter how far they traveled. "I've been thinking about Sarah's letters again," Bear said, as they prepared to head inside. "About her dream of filling this house with family." And I think she got exactly what she wanted. Not the way she imagined it, but exactly what she wanted. Evelyn took his hand, Sarah's ring catching the porch light between her fingers. Do you think she knew? Somehow, do you think she knew you'd find us? Bear looked up at the stars Sarah had loved, remembering her conviction that love was the only thing that truly mattered, that wealth without love was just an elaborate form of poverty. I think she knew that if I ever stopped being afraid of happiness, I'd recognize it when it found me. They walked inside together, turning off lights and checking locks, performing the small rituals that marked the end of another day in a life that had become everything Bear had never dared to hope for. In his study, the new family portrait sat beside an older photograph of Sarah, two images that told the complete story of a man who'd learned that love was the only inheritance worth leaving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to prove that second chances were real for those brave enough to embrace them. The children would grow and change, eventually creating families of their own. The ranch would prosper under their stewardship. The new house would shelter generations of children who would never know what it meant to be homeless. But tonight, Bear McAllister fell asleep in a house made warm by love, listening to the sound of his wife's breathing beside him, knowing that he'd finally learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich was about accumulating things. Wealthy was about accumulating moments like this, ordinary evenings, made extraordinary by the presence of people who chose to love each other across all the barriers that usually kept families apart. In the new house across the valley, 5 children slept in beds that belonged to them, in rooms designed for their individual needs, on land that would be theirs forever. And in the master bedroom of that house, 2 coffee cups sat on the nightstand, waiting for tomorrow's morning ritual and another day of building the kind of family that Sarah had always known was possible. The story had come full circle, from one lonely coffee cup to 2, from empty rooms to laughter-filled halls, from the fear of loss to the courage to love again. Some fairy tales, Bear had learned, were worth the wait.